The office building rises quietly against a grey November sky. It is 1967. The windows are long and narrow, and the light inside them is the colour of old paper. From the street you can hear the faint clatter of typewriters, a sound like rain on a tin roof, rhythmic and constant, beginning before 8 in the morning and ending sometime after 5. The women who make that sound arrive early. They arrive in heels and pressed skirts, handbags tucked under their arms, lipstick already applied, hair already set. They ride the elevator in silence or small conversation. They settle at their desks the way birds settle on a wire, briefly, carefully, always aware of what is watching. Their arrival is quiet. Their preparation is quiet. The office they walk into is not yet running, and they are the ones who will start it. The office smells of carbon paper and cigarette smoke, of percolated coffee left too long on the burner, of the particular dry warmth that comes from a building sealed against the cold. There are flowers on the reception desk, carnations usually, or something from a market on the corner, and a row of filing cabinets along the far wall, their steel faces dull in the fluorescent light. The floor is linoleum, pale and slightly scuffed near the high-traffic paths between the desks and the door and the small kitchen where the coffee is made. The ceiling is low, the windows, if you sit near one, give you a rectangle of sky that changes slowly through the day, from grey-white in the morning to something dimmer and more closed by afternoon, then dark by the time 5 o'clock comes and the coats go on, and the elevator descends and the street receives its daily dispersal of women in heels making their way home through the winter air. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. You have been hired as a secretary. The ad in the newspaper said typing speed required, pleasant manner, no prior experience necessary. It said nothing about what prior experience would have prepared you for. You wore your best blouse on the day of the interview, and you folded your hands in your lap and you smiled when it seemed appropriate, and you answered questions about your shorthand speed and your availability and your experience with specific office equipment. You were not asked about your career goals. The question was not within the frame of the interview, which assumed a trajectory that did not include career goals in the usual sense. Now here you are. Your desk is positioned outside a closed door. Behind that door is a man whose name you will learn to say in a particular way. Quickly, without emphasis. The way you say the name of weather or of geography. Something fixed and environmental that you navigate rather than engage. You will type his letters. You will answer his telephone. You will pour his coffee. You will remember his appointments and manage his correspondence and anticipate his needs before they are expressed. You will do all of these things well, and you will do them invisibly, and you will understand, though no one says it plainly, that invisibility is part of the job, that the mark of a good secretary is the degree to which her work disappears into its results, leaving only the smooth running of the office and the executive behind the closed door moving through his day without obstacle or interruption. The obstacles and the interruptions are yours to handle before they reach him. The smooth day is his. This is the arrangement. The other women at their desks around you have been here longer. Some of them have been here for years. They know things about this place that you will learn slowly, which draw sticks, which client calls on Fridays, which silences mean hurry and which mean wait. They have absorbed over time the particular grammar of this office, its rhythms and hierarchies and the invisible codes that govern how things are done and what is expected and what is acceptable. They do not speak about certain things directly. There is a knowledge that passes between them in glances, in the careful way they adjust their posture when certain footsteps come down the hall, in the small exchanges that happen in the kitchen while the coffee's made, in the quick private conversations over lunch at the luncheonette around the corner. You will come to understand what those adjustments mean. It will take time. But when you do understand, you will find that there is no name for what you have learned. Not yet. The year is 1967. The word does not exist yet. The law does not recognize it yet. For now, it is simply the air of the place, simply the way things are, simply the thing you manage, quietly, every day. There is a photograph, taken somewhere in the middle of the American 1960s, of a secretarial pool. The room is long and well lit, the desks arranged in neat rows, each one occupied by a woman in a dark skirt or a plaid dress, hair pinned or set, posture careful. The typewriters on the desks are large and black, the substantial machines of that era, their keys worn smooth with use. The women are young. Most of them appear to be in their 20s, and they are all looking at their work, not at the camera. They are typing or reading their steno pads or reaching for sheets of carbon paper with the practiced motion of people who have done this many times before. The photograph was taken to celebrate something about the company, an anniversary perhaps, or a new building, or simply the general prosperity of a business that was doing well in the expanding American economy of the post-war decades. The women are part of the background. The image was not taken to document them. It was taken to document the office, and the office happens to contain them. This is a story about the women in photographs like that one. It is a story about a world that existed before a certain set of words existed, before the language caught up to the experience, before the law acknowledged what millions of women already knew in their bodies and in the careful adjustments they made every morning before walking through a door. It is a story about what happens when something real and harmful has no name, and what happens when, finally, someone gives it one. It is told slowly because the years it describes moved slowly, because the patience of the women who lived through them deserves a slow telling. The American office of the post-war decades was a particular kind of world. The war had ended, the men had returned, and the women who had worked in factories and offices during the years of absence were expected, gently, then not so gently, to recede. Some did, some could not afford to. The 1950s brought a version of domesticity that was sold like furniture, in glossy advertisements, in the magazines that sat in waiting rooms and beauty parlours, the clean kitchen, the waiting dinner, the woman whose satisfaction resided entirely in the smooth running of a household. But not every woman lived in that advertisement. Many lived at a desk. By the early 1960s, the American workforce included tens of millions of women, and a significant portion of them worked in offices. They were typists, stenographers, receptionists, secretaries, the clerical infrastructure of an expanding economy that needed more administrative capacity than any previous generation had required. These were the jobs available to women who wanted professional employment, respectable jobs, the kind that required neat handwriting and a pleasant telephone manner and the ability to take shorthand at speed. The jobs were not highly paid. They were not considered careers in the aspirational sense, the sense of a trajectory, a progression, a path toward increasing responsibility and authority and compensation. The assumption, shared by employers and often by the women themselves, was that this was a temporary arrangement, something you did until you married, until the real life began. The desk was a waiting room for a different future. But the waiting rooms filled up and stayed full. Women kept working, kept returning after marriage, kept returning after children, kept filling the desks that needed to be filled every morning in offices that could not function without them. They kept working because the rent needed paying, and the groceries needed buying, and the future everyone had promised was slower to arrive than advertised, or had arrived in a form that included a desk in an office rather than a kitchen in a house. And so the American office became a place where women lived out long stretches of their working lives in a particular arrangement of power, surrounded by men who held the titles and the salaries, managing the lives of those men in ways that were essential and largely unacknowledged. What happened in those offices, what was done to the women who worked in them, what was said, what was permitted, what was expected, had no formal name. There was no legal category for it, no human resources procedure designed to address it, no training program that mentioned it, no policy that prohibited it. When a woman was touched without wanting to be touched, when she was spoken to in ways that made the air feel unsafe, when her employment was conditioned on her response to a man's desires, there was no word for what was being done to her. There were other words. There were dismissals and there were explanations and there were silences. But there was no single word that gathered the experience into a category, that held it up to the light as a thing that happened and that was wrong. That word would not come until 1975. And in its absence, the experience continued, day after day, in offices across the country, in the quiet spaces between the clatter of the typewriters and the ringing of the telephones, in the space between what the employment handbooks described and what the working day actually contained. The women managed, they developed strategies, they built friendships, they navigated, and they waited without knowing they were waiting for the world to find the words that would make it possible to change. This is a quiet story. It is told at the pace of the offices it describes, slowly, carefully, with attention to the small things, the smell of typing paper, the sound of a door, the weight of a hand on a shoulder that was not meant to be touched, the long walk to the elevator at the end of the day, and what it felt like to step outside into the air. Settle now. Let the office close around you, steady and familiar, lit by its fluorescent light, warm with its percolated coffee, full of the quiet rhythm of keys, and we will begin. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. New stories are posted every week, waiting for you whenever you return. To understand what happened in those offices, you have to understand the office itself, what it meant, what it contained, what it required of the people inside it. The American office of the post-war decades was not simply a place of work. It was a social world, with its own rituals and hierarchies and unwritten codes, and the position of secretary sat at the centre of that world, in a way that was both essential and precarious. It was a world that had grown enormously in the years since the Second World War, fed by the expansion of corporations and government agencies and insurance companies and law firms, each of them requiring more clerical labour than the last, each of them drawing from the same pool of women who had been trained in typing and shorthand and the management of office systems. The office was everywhere, and the secretary was its centre. The word secretary comes from the Latin secretarius, meaning a person entrusted with secrets. In the medieval world, a secretary was an intimate confidant, a trusted keeper of correspondence and private counsel, a figure close to the powerful, managing the flow of information that power depended upon. By the 20th century, the word had narrowed considerably, and with it the role, but something of that original meaning persisted in the way the job actually functioned, in the daily reality of offices where women held an intimate knowledge of professional lives they could not formally share in. A good secretary knew everything about her employer's professional world, his schedule, his clients, his debts, his habits, his anxieties, the names of his children and the preferences of his most important clients. She managed the flow of information to and from his office with a discretion that was expected and never thanked. She was trusted with secrets in the older sense of the word. She was simply not compensated as though those secrets had value. The post-war decades were the golden age of the American secretary, if golden is the right word for a role defined by proximity to power one could not share. The expanding economy, the growth of corporations, the boom in white-collar employment, all of this created an enormous demand for clerical labour, and that labour was almost entirely female. By 1960, there were more than 6 million secretaries in the United States. By 1970, the number had grown considerably. They worked in insurance companies and law firms, in government offices and advertising agencies, in the corporate towers that were being built in every American city. Their floors divided into the private offices of executives and the open pools of women who served them. They worked in hospitals and universities and publishing houses and retail headquarters, in the offices of senators and in the local offices of the federal bureaucracy, in the back rooms of small businesses and in the glass towers of Fortune 500 companies. The secretary was so ubiquitous as to be nearly invisible, present everywhere, seen as part of the furniture of professional life, her labour as taken for granted as the chairs and the filing cabinets that surrounded her. The typing pool was the most visible expression of this arrangement. In large organisations, secretarial labour was organised like a factory floor, rows of desks, rows of women, a supervisor walking the aisles, a quota of pages per hour. The sound of it was particular. The chorus of typewriter keys, the zing of the carriage return, the thud of paper stacked and restacked, the low murmur of conversation between tasks. Women who worked in typing pools described a certain rhythm to the days, the morning surge of dictation, the afternoon push to finish, the 5 o'clock dispersal that left the room suddenly and completely quiet. There was in those pools a kind of industrial precision, the management of human bodies in service of institutional production, that was not so different from the factory floor except that it was quieter, better lit, and conducted in skirts rather than overalls. For the private secretary, the one who sat outside a single executive's door, the arrangement was different in character, if not in fundamental structure. She had more autonomy, more variety, more visibility. She was less a unit of production and more a personal instrument. She screened calls, managed correspondence, handled whatever the executive needed handled, and developed over time an intimate knowledge of his professional life that no one else in the organisation possessed. She knew which clients he liked and which he avoided, which calls to put through immediately and which to hold, how to soften a refusal in a letter without making it seem like a door had been firmly closed. She knew his moods, the particular quality of a Tuesday morning after a difficult Monday, the way a business lunch had gone from the tone of his voice when he returned to the office. In exchange for this intimacy, she received a salary considerably lower than his, no path to advancement, and a set of expectations that extended well beyond typing. Those expectations were the invisible architecture of the job. They were never written down in the employment manuals, never listed in the classified advertisements that ran in the daily newspapers, beside the display ads for secretarial schools and typing courses, but every woman who took a secretarial position understood them. You understood them from the way the interview was conducted, from the questions that were asked and not asked, from the way the man behind the desk looked at you when you came in. The questions at the interview were about your typing speed, and your shorthand accuracy, and your experience with office equipment, and your availability for overtime. They were not about your career goals, because the assumption was that you did not have career goals in the way that men had career goals. You were expected to be pleasant at all times. You were expected to be attractive, or at least well-groomed in the particular way that suggested effort without calling attention to itself. You were expected to be competent and quiet about your competence, to be the kind of person whose work was noticed only when something went wrong. You were expected to manage not only tasks but moods, to sense when the office needed smoothing and to smooth it, when the executive was under pressure, and to absorb some of that pressure invisibly, when a visitor needed charming, and to be charming without making the charming conspicuous. This was the emotional labour of the position, though that phrase did not yet exist in the early 1960s. It was simply what was required. It was expected the way punctuality was expected and accuracy was expected, as a feature of competence, as part of what it meant to be good at the job. A secretary who could not manage the atmosphere of the office was not a good secretary, regardless of her typing speed. A secretary who made visible the effort that managing required was somehow failing at something, though the failure was difficult to name. The women who did this work were skilled at it in ways that the men who employed them rarely acknowledged. The skills required, emotional management, social navigation, the rapid assessment of human need, and the equally rapid provision of what was needed, were real and considerable. They went by other names. They were called pleasantness, or helpfulness, or simply being good at your job. They were not called what they were, which was labour, because labour implies compensation, and the compensation for these particular skills was the job itself. You were paid to type. The rest was understood to come with being a woman. This arrangement was not a conspiracy exactly. It was not planned or coordinated in any conscious way. It was simply a set of expectations so deeply embedded in the culture of professional life that they did not need to be stated, because everyone already knew them, because they had been in place for as long as any living person could remember. The secretarial schools that trained the women who filled these positions understood the full scope of what they were training them for. The curricula of secretarial schools in the 1950s and 1960s covered typing and shorthand and bookkeeping and office management, but they also covered something less technical, the presentation of self, the management of professional relationships, the cultivation of the kind of personality that employers wanted to have outside their offices. The Catherine Gibbs School, one of the most prestigious secretarial institutions in the country, was known for the careful attention it paid to the deportment and appearance of its graduates, the way they walked and spoke and presented themselves, the impression they made before they had typed a single word. This was not considered separate from professional training. It was professional training, for a profession that was understood to include the whole person. You settle at your desk. The morning is beginning. The coffee is percolating somewhere down the hall, and the fluorescent lights are humming at their particular pitch, and somewhere beyond the closed door behind you, the day is already being organised in ways you will be asked to carry out. The typewriter is cool under your fingers. The paper waits. There is in the morning office a particular quality of anticipation, not quite excitement, not quite dread. That is the quality of a day that has not yet begun, that holds within it the full range of what the hours might bring. You know some of what they will bring. You've been here long enough to know the rhythms, the expectations, the shape of a working day in this office, in this city, in this decade. You breathe slowly and let the morning begin. There were books written for you. This is worth knowing, worth sitting with for a moment. The fact that someone took the time to write them, to have them printed and distributed in attractive covers, to place them in the hands of the women who were learning the job. They were called secretarial guides, or office manuals, or handbooks for the professional secretary, and they were thorough and earnest and full of good intentions and very careful not to say certain things. They covered everything from the correct form of address for a letter to a senator, to the proper care of a typewriter ribbon, to the management of a boss's appointments during his absence. They were detailed in their attention to the technical requirements of the work, and they were careful in their attention to the social requirements, and they also contained, in their earnest and detailed way, a fairly complete map of the world they were designed to prepare you for, a world they described with accuracy and without comment, as though its arrangements were simply the natural shape of professional life, as unremarkable as the filing cabinets and the percolators. The guides agreed on certain fundamentals. A good secretary was loyal, she was discreet, she was accurate, she was punctual, she had good grammar and clear handwriting, and the ability to take dictation at speed without losing a syllable. She knew how to format a letter correctly, how to answer a telephone professionally, how to file documents so that they could be retrieved without delay. These were the technical qualifications, and they were real, and women who possessed them took a professional pride in them that was entirely warranted. The skill of taking shorthand at speed, holding the flow of speech in your hand, translating it into symbols that could be decoded hours later into perfect prose, was genuinely difficult, genuinely impressive, genuinely the product of months of training and years of practice. The guides acknowledged this in their thorough way. They did not, however, stop at the technical. A secretary, the guides advised, should be pleasant in manner and agreeable in disposition. She should avoid conflict with her employer or with the office's clients. She should dress appropriately, neat, conservative, feminine without being conspicuous, which was its own kind of instruction, its own set of calibrations about how to occupy space in a way that was noticed for the right reasons and not the wrong ones. She should maintain a calm and cheerful demeanour, even when she did not feel calm or cheerful, because the office was not a place for the display of personal feeling. This was stated as professional advice, as a mark of maturity, as the kind of emotional management that separated the competent professional from the amateur. It was not stated as a description of what women were being asked to perform, day after day, in service of an institution that did not reciprocate the performance. She should anticipate her employer's needs before they were expressed. This was one of the highest commendations the guides could offer. The secretary who knew what was needed before it was asked, who had prepared the file before the employer realized he needed it, who had made the phone call before the employer thought to request it. This anticipatory quality was described as a form of intelligence, of professional attunement. It was also a description of a particular kind of labour that has no easy name, the labour of being continuously attuned to another person's state and needs, of running a constant background process of monitoring and prediction, of making yourself so useful that your usefulness disappears into its own results. She should make herself, in the phrase that appeared in several of these volumes, indispensable. The word indispensable carried a particular weight in that context. It was offered as aspiration, as the highest compliment a secretary could earn, the goal toward which all her training and effort was directed. But indispensable also meant unable to be replaced, and unable to be replaced also meant, in practice, unable to leave without causing disruption, unable to advocate for a raise without threatening the stability of the office's operations, unable to be absent without consequence. An indispensable woman was one whose departure would inconvenience the office, and because she was indispensable she stayed, and because she stayed she was never considered for promotion, because promoting her would require replacing her, and replacing her was the very thing that her indispensability made difficult. The circle closed quietly around her, and the guides called it success. Some guides addressed the question of what to do when a boss behaved badly, when his manner was difficult, when his demands were excessive, when his expectations went beyond what was written in any job description. This was not phrased in those terms. The language was gentler, more oblique, in the way that language is when it wants to acknowledge something without quite saying it. The guide spoke of handling difficult personalities, of managing a boss who was temperamental or demanding, of the importance of maintaining a professional equilibrium in challenging circumstances. They spoke of the importance of not taking things personally, a phrase that was doing enormous work in that context, carrying within it an entire set of instructions about how to receive whatever was done or said, without allowing it to penetrate, without allowing it to become the kind of thing you named and addressed. The guides advised that a secretary should develop a professional distance from whatever she encountered in the course of her duties. This distance was not coldness, they clarified. It was maturity. It was the mark of a true professional, someone who had learned to separate the self from the work in the way that all professionals must learn, in the way that a doctor must learn not to take a patient's death personally, or a lawyer must learn to represent a client whose actions she finds repugnant. The comparison was flattering in its implication that secretarial work was a profession of the same order as medicine or law. It was less flattering in what it was asking the secretary to manage, which was not the difficulty of professional distance in an abstract sense, but the specific and continuous management of being treated, in ways small and large, as something less than a full person in a professional context. What the guides did not say, could not say in that language at that time, was that some of what a secretary encountered in the course of her duties was not a personality difficulty. Some of it was something else, something the guides had no framework for because the framework did not exist yet. The language of the guides assumed that the problems of the office were problems of manner, of temperament, of professional friction between personalities. They had no vocabulary for the specific harm of a man who used his position to make demands of a woman that were not professional in nature, who made her employment or advancement contingent on her response to those demands, who touched her or spoke to her in ways that were not about the work at all, but about something else entirely, something that the guides, in their earnest and thorough way, could not name and therefore could not address. The guides also said a great deal about loyalty. A secretary's loyalty to her employer was treated as a kind of sacred professional obligation, the foundational virtue of the role. She would learn things about her employer, his affairs, both business and personal, his vulnerabilities, his errors, his misjudgments, and she would hold these things in confidence with the absolute discretion of a confessor. She would not gossip. She would not confide. She would carry the secrets of the office to the end of her employment and beyond, because this was what professionalism required, and she was a professional. The guides described this loyalty in terms that were almost reverential, as though the secretary's discretion were a form of honour, a quality that elevated her in the hierarchy of professional virtues. The loyalty that the guides described was not mutual. It was not expected to be mutual. An employer might let a secretary go without warning, might replace her with someone younger or cheaper, or simply different, might fail to recognise her work in ways that would have seemed unthinkable in the other direction. The guides acknowledged this asymmetry without naming it. They simply advised the secretary to understand that her employer's obligations lay elsewhere, with the business and its clients and its shareholders, and that she should not expect from him the kind of personal loyalty she was expected to provide. This was, in its way, accurate advice. It was also a description of a fundamentally unequal relationship being presented as a professional norm, as simply the way things were, as natural as the arrangement of the furniture. You read these guides the way you read instructions for a journey you are already on, with recognition, with the occasional surprise of something put into words that you had only felt before, with the particular alertness of a reader who knows that the text has gaps, that there are things it is not saying, that the spaces between the sentences are full of the experience it cannot quite bring itself to describe. The office takes shape around you as you read, the fluorescent light, the carbon paper, the closed door and the desk outside it, the coffee that will be your responsibility and the letters that will bear his name. Let the words of the guides settle over you like a fine dust, the way the advice of those books settled into the lives of the women who read them, absorbed and applied and carried through years of working life, doing their imperfect work in an imperfect world. The typewriter waits. The morning is beginning. Let the quiet of the office hold you for a moment before the day begins. The day in an American office of the 1960s followed a rhythm as reliable as the movement of water, predictable in its general shape and variable in its particulars, arriving each morning with the same basic requirements, and leaving each evening with a different specific residue. It began before the executives arrived. The women came first, the secretaries, the typists, the receptionists, and they prepared the space. They unlocked their desks and opened the drawers in a particular order that became second nature over time. They set up their typewriters, checked the ribbon, inserted fresh paper into the carriage with the practiced motion of a person who has done the same thing several hundred times and could do it in the dark. They sorted the mail that had arrived in the overnight basket, organising it by sender and urgency in a system that their employer had specified or that they had developed themselves to manage his preferences. They checked the appointment book. They emptied the ashtrays. If they had not been emptied the night before, they put the coffee on. The coffee was a thing unto itself. In most offices of that period, the responsibility for the coffee fell to the women, the secretaries and receptionists who had arrived early and who understood, without being told directly, that this was among their responsibilities. The making of coffee was not a task listed in anyone's job description. It was not included in the secretarial guide's enumeration of professional duties. It was simply what happened in the morning, as reliably as the mail in the appointment book, and the women who made the coffee understood that making it was part of making the office ready, part of the preparation that preceded the executive's arrival, and that made their arrival smooth and their mornings functional. The arrangement of the office into the shape it needed to be in when the men arrived was labour of a specific and invisible kind. When a secretary prepared her employer's desk so that the papers he would need were on top, in the order he would need them, she was performing a task that required knowledge and judgment and care, the knowledge of what the day would bring, the judgment about which information would be most immediately relevant, the care to present it in a form that was legible and efficient. But because it was done before he arrived, he experienced only its result, a desk that was ready. The preparation itself was invisible. The skill it required was invisible. The woman who performed it was visible only as a body in the chair outside his door, available when needed, unobtrusive when not. The mornings were often the busiest time, and also the most collaborative in a technical sense. The secretary and her employer working in a particular kind of tandem that the rest of the day seldom replicated. Dictation came first, the executive standing or sitting, speaking his letters and memos in that particular cadence that was neither quite speech nor quite writing. The secretary taking it down in the shorthand symbols she had spent months learning, the room filled with his voice and the scratch of her pencil on the steno pad. He would speak without pausing to formulate, trusting that she would capture not only the words but the intent, the emphasis, the specific professional tone that the letter required. She would hold all of this in her notation, in those graceful compressed symbols, and later she would return to it and reconstruct from it the full text that he had only sketched. Then came the typing, the long careful hours of transcribing those shorthand symbols into clean, correctly formatted letters on the company's letterhead. This was work that required concentration and accuracy. A single transposed letter in a client's name, a wrong figure in a financial summary, an incorrect date in a legal correspondence, and the letter would need to be retyped entirely because correction fluid was slow and imprecise, and certain levels of professional correspondence did not tolerate visible corrections. Carbon copies for the files, the original in the outgoing mail tray by noon, and the whole sequence, dictation, transcription, typing, correction, copying, performed under the silent expectation of accuracy and speed, with no acknowledged margin for error. Shorthand was a skill that took real time to acquire. The Pitman system, the most commonly used, had its own logic, its own elegance, a complete written language based on phonetics, its symbols graceful and compact, able to represent the flow of speech at speeds that made ordinary writing impossible. The thick and thin lines of the Pitman symbols representing consonants of different weights, the placement of vowel marks, the special contractions for common words and phrases, these were the elements of a system that required months to learn and years to master. Women who were good at it were genuinely good at something difficult, something that required a trained ear and a disciplined hand, and the ability to hold the meaning of a sentence in your mind while your hand moved to record the one that came after it. It was not a simple skill. It was simply not described as anything other than a secretarial requirement. After the morning dictation and typing came the administrative middle of the day, phone calls to be received and transferred or held depending on who was calling and whether the executive was available or in conference, or simply not in the mood for certain conversations. There was an art to the management of telephone calls that went well beyond the technical, the ability to assess a caller's mood and adjust your own accordingly, to deliver refusals in tones that did not give offence, to hold a caller's impatience at bay while you determined whether the connection would be made. Visitors to be announced or redirected, their names written in the appointment book in the secretary's careful hand, their comfort managed in the few minutes between arrival and admission, correspondence to be filed, always filed immediately and correctly, because the file that could not be found quickly was a failure of the whole system. Lunch was often short, and it was one of the few times in the day when the office's social atmosphere could be set aside entirely. Some women brought food from home and ate at their desks, making the desk serve double duty as dining table and professional station, a small act of efficiency that also, in a subtle way, signalled the depth of their commitment, the degree to which their presence in the office extended even into the hours theoretically set aside for the self. Others went out in pairs or small groups, to the coffee shop on the ground floor or the luncheonette around the corner, where the tables were small and the menus were laminated and the coffee came in thick ceramic cups that warmed your hands through the handle. There was a particular pleasure in those lunches, the release of the office's atmosphere, the noise and warmth of a different room, the freedom of a conversation that was entirely your own and could range wherever you chose without the implicit monitoring of the professional space. Women who worked together for years developed a friendship that sustained them through the days, a shared language of glances and half-sentences, a collective understanding of the office's conditions that required no explanation because it was held in common. They could say, over lunch, the things that could not be said at the desk, could name the weariness, the frustration, the specific incidents that had made the morning difficult. In the private space of lunch, among women who understood, the day could be spoken plainly. The afternoons were slower. The urgency of the morning dissipated into the longer hours of afternoon, and the office settled into a different rhythm. Steadier, less interrupted, the typewriters going at their measured pace, the phone ringing less frequently, the light from the narrow windows shifting from bright to pale as the afternoon moved toward its end. There was a quality of suspension in those hours, a sense of the day waiting to conclude, of everyone in the office inhabiting the same slow approach to 5 o'clock. The work continued, but the quality of attention required was different, less reactive, more sustained, the concentrated effort of long typing projects and complex filing tasks, and the steady accumulation of the day's administrative requirements. 5 o'clock came, the typewriters stopped, the carbon paper was gathered, the appointment books were closed, the desks were tidied into the shape they needed to be in for the next morning's preparation. The women put on their coats and collected their handbags and rode the elevator down and walked out into the street, which by 5 o'clock in winter was already dark, the air cold and smelling of exhaust and, somewhere at the back of it, the particular city smell of stone and distance and 10,000 people, all heading toward the same exit from the same long day. They went home, or to the grocery store, or to pick up children from school, or to some other piece of a life that existed outside the office's hours. The office continued without them, or rather it waited in the dark for them to come back in the morning and prepare it again, and tomorrow they would. The desk would be there, the typewriter would be there, the appointment book, the carbon paper, the percolator, the narrow window with its rectangle of sky, and somewhere behind the closed door the particular atmosphere of the place, unchanged and familiar and requiring, as it always required, the steady invisible labour of the women who kept it running. Breathe slowly now, and let the 5 o'clock feeling settle in you, the small release of the day ending, the coat going on, the door closing behind you. Rest. There is a way that certain things become ordinary that has nothing to do with their being acceptable. It has to do with repetition, with the slow accumulation of days in which a thing happens and is not addressed, not named, not responded to in a way that disrupts the continuing function of the room. In the American office of the 1960s, certain things happened every day, in offices all across the country, and they were not addressed, not named, not disrupted. They became ordinary in the only way that harmful things become ordinary, by continuing. The desk was there every morning, the typewriter was there every morning, the coffee and the appointment book and the carbon paper and the narrow window were all there every morning, and so was the particular quality of the air, the particular permission structure of the office, the ambient understanding of what was acceptable and what was required, and what a woman was expected to receive without comment. A hand on the shoulder. It happened often, more often than any individual incident can convey, because its frequency was part of its meaning. An employer passing behind a secretary's desk would rest his hand on her shoulder for a moment, briefly, without explanation, without acknowledgement, and continue walking. The touch was small. It was over in seconds. It was not mentioned afterward by either party. But it was not random, and it was not comfortable, and the woman at the desk understood its meaning in the way that you understand the meaning of something that has no words, through the body, immediately, in the tightening of something small and deep that did not relax immediately when the hand was removed. The hand on the shoulder was the mildest point on a spectrum that extended much further. Women who worked in offices in those decades describe a world in which physical contact, uninvited, unasked, unremarkable to everyone except the woman receiving it, was a routine feature of the workday. A man might sit on a secretary's desk while talking to her, his body positioned too close, occupying a portion of her professional space in a way that made her unable to rise, without making the situation more awkward than it already was. The desk was her workspace, the place where she did her work, the professional territory she occupied during the hours she was paid to be there, and his sitting on it was a casual assertion that her territory was also in some sense his. A man might lean over her shoulder to look at something she was typing, close enough that she could feel his breath near her neck, close enough that moving away would require explanation. A man might touch her hair, comment on it as though it were an object he was evaluating rather than part of a person. He might comment on her appearance in terms that were simultaneously complimentary and invasive, the compliment and the invasion arriving together, inseparable, so that declining the invasion would mean declining the compliment and making the situation difficult. He might place his hand on the small of her back when steering her through a doorway, the hand that was ostensibly assistance but was also contact, also the establishment of a particular physical relationship in a professional context where she had not invited physical relationship. These things happened. They happened constantly. They happened in full view of other people who did not intervene because there was no understanding, not yet, not in that time, that intervention was warranted. The verbal dimension of this world was equally persistent, equally woven into the texture of the ordinary day. The comments made about a woman's appearance were considered a form of appreciation, even a courtesy. The boss who noticed that you had cut your hair, who told you that you looked nice today, who made remarks that moved, sometimes gradually and sometimes all at once, into territory that was not appreciation but something else, something that required her to receive it without reacting to it, to manage her face and her posture and her voice in a way that neither encouraged nor explicitly refused. The jokes that depended for their effect on the woman's discomfort, the remarks made in the presence of clients that framed her as an object of evaluation, rather than a professional in the same room, the language that appeared in office memos and company literature describing secretaries in terms girl, sweetheart, honey, that would never have been applied to the men in the same room. These were the small constant elements of a working atmosphere that made certain things normal by treating them as normal. Women who experienced this describe a particular kind of cognitive work that it required. You learned to manage your responses in real time, to receive what was done or said, and to return a face that was neutral, or pleasantly unresponsive, or briefly and professionally acknowledging before moving on. You learned the specific calibration of a smile that acknowledged without inviting, a tone of voice that was pleasant without being warm, a posture that was professional without being stiff, which would have been its own kind of comment. You learned not to show the thing you actually felt, because showing it would create a complication, a disruption in the smooth running of the office that would somehow, in the alchemy of the office's social logic, become your complication to manage. The man who had said or done the thing would not manage it. He would in all likelihood not notice that there was anything to manage. He had made a comment or a gesture, and it had been received and life had continued, and he understood from the absence of disruption that the comment or gesture had been acceptable, had been within the range of what was normal in the space he occupied. This confirmation, the absence of disruption, the continuing smooth surface of the office's social life, was itself a form of permission, a renewal of the ambient understanding that what had happened was within the acceptable range. And so it continued, and became more normal, and the normal became more ordinary, and the ordinary became the furniture of the working world. This management was exhausting in a way that was invisible because it was constant. It did not spike into crisis and then subside, leaving long periods of relief between the difficult moments. It was the background condition of the workday, the steady drain of attention and energy required to navigate an environment that was not quite safe, in which a portion of your cognitive capacity was always running the process of assessment and response that the environment required. Women who have described this period in their working lives often reach for the word vigilance, a vigilance that was not dramatic but constant, the way vigilance is when it is required not in emergencies but in ordinary time, in the regular hours of the day. And then there was the worst thing, the thing that was not a hand on a shoulder or a comment about your hair, the thing that crossed from the ambient into the specific and unambiguous, A boss who closed his office door and did not keep his hands to himself. A boss who made clear in some way that left no possible confusion about what he meant, that certain favours were expected in exchange for continued employment, or for advancement, or for being left alone, that her professional standing was not simply the product of her work, but was contingent on her response to his desires. This happened. It happened in offices across the country, in small businesses and large corporations, in government offices and law firms and insurance companies and advertising agencies. It happened to women who were new to the job, and to women who had been there for years. It happened to women who were young, and to women who were middle-aged. And when it happened, the woman was almost entirely alone in it. She was alone because there was no framework for what had happened to her. There was no legal category, no human resources department trained to receive her account, no procedure she could follow to report the thing and have it addressed. There was no word for it. She knew what had happened. Her body knew, her mind knew. She knew with a clarity that required no vocabulary. But the world around her had no mechanism for receiving that knowledge and acting on it. The world around her, in its structures and its language and its institutional arrangements, behaved as though what had not happened, or was not the kind of thing that warranted a response, or was a private matter between her and the man involved that did not rise to the level of institutional concern. She could tell a friend. She could tell her husband if she had one, and he might be angry at the man, or angry at her, or both, in the way that people are angry when a situation makes them feel helpless, and the helplessness has to go somewhere. She could leave the job, which meant losing her income and starting over with the next employer, and explaining the departure in a way that would not damage her employability, which meant not explaining it truthfully. She could stay and endure and find ways to manage and continue to manage day after day, in the small and exhausting ways she had already been managing. These were her options. They were the only options the world of that time provided. Let them rest in the quiet for a moment. The office is still. The evening is coming in at the windows, and the women are going home, carrying what they carry, through streets that ask nothing of them, into evenings that belong to themselves. When a woman complained, things happened. The sequence was not random. It had a pattern, consistent enough across industries, cities, and decades to suggest that it was not the result of individual decisions but of a system, a set of expectations and responses so thoroughly internalized that they operated without instruction, without coordination, without anyone having to sit down and decide what the policy would be. There was no policy, there was simply a consensus, absorbed through years of professional socialization, about what happened when a woman said that something had been done to her that was wrong. The consensus shaped the responses shaped the outcomes, and the outcomes repeated often enough shaped the silence that preceded the next complaint. The first response was often disbelief, not aggressive disbelief, not the confrontational kind that comes with raised voices and demands for proof, the kind that makes the encounter feel like an adversarial proceeding from the first moment. The quiet kind, the kind that presents itself as concern, as a desire to understand, as a willingness to hear her out while never quite accepting the possibility that what she was describing was real in the way she was describing it. The man she was describing was a professional, a colleague, a person with a reputation, and a career, and relationships with people who valued him. The personnel officer who was receiving her complaint had perhaps worked alongside this man for years, had eaten lunch with him, had attended his daughter's graduation party. Her account of what he had done placed all of that in a different light, and the adjustment required to accept her account was considerable. It was much easier, much less disruptive to the existing order of things to adjust the account instead. The adjustments were subtle and various, and they are worth cataloguing because they were consistent across many different offices and many different years, which suggests they were not improvised but drawn from a shared cultural vocabulary of doubt. Perhaps she had misunderstood his intentions. Men could be thoughtless, could be unaware of how their behaviour came across, could touch a shoulder or make a comment without realising the effect it had on the recipient. He had not meant anything by it. He was simply that way with everyone. It was his manner, it was not personal. He was not that kind of man. She, perhaps, had been too sensitive, had read meaning into a gesture that was innocent, had allowed a small thing to grow into something larger in her mind, had been predisposed by some personal history or emotional difficulty to interpret normal professional behaviour as threatening. The people receiving her complaint were not lying when they offered these adjustments. They believed them, or they believed something close to them. They believed in the man's character as they understood it, and they found it easier to adjust the account than to revise the character. They had no framework for doing otherwise. They had no training in how to receive a complaint about sexual conduct in the workplace, because such training did not exist, because the legal and institutional framework that would eventually create such training had not yet been built. They were doing what they knew how to do, which was to manage a social disruption in the way that social disruptions were managed, by smoothing the surface, by returning to the familiar arrangement, by ensuring that the office continued to function in the way it had functioned before the complaint introduced its disturbance. The second response, if the complaint persisted, was often a kind of administrative management that was not quite investigation and not quite dismissal but something in between. A process that was visible enough to suggest that the complaint had been received, but not substantive enough to actually address what had been described. The personnel office would note the complaint. A file would be opened. The man might be spoken to, a conversation that would be brief and that he might later describe with complete sincerity as a misunderstanding that had been cleared up, as a matter of miscommunication that had been addressed. He would return to his office. Nothing in his professional life would change. Something would change in hers. She would be moved to a different desk, perhaps, relocated within the office in a way that was presented as a practical arrangement, a matter of workflow and space, unrelated to the complaint she had made. Or she would find that the small daily courtesies of the workplace had become less available to her. The informal invitations, the collegial conversations at the coffee station, the easy inclusion in the social fabric of the office that makes the working day humanly tolerable. She would find herself at a slight angle to the office's social world, not quite excluded, not quite comfortable, recognisably the person who had created a difficulty by naming it. The man she'd complained about would continue his work uninterrupted. She would continue her work in a room that had become, in ways that were real, but almost impossible to document, colder. This cooling was not organised. It was not punishment in any formal sense. It simply happened, the way warmth disperses when a window is left open, without decision, without plan, in the natural way of environments that have been disturbed and are returning to their previous equilibrium. The equilibrium that existed before her complaint was the one to which the office was returning. She was the disturbance that needed to be absorbed. The man was the equilibrium. The third response, in the more serious cases, was termination. Women who complained about what their employers had done to them were fired, or were given conditions of continued employment that made staying impossible, or found that their hours were reduced, or their assignments changed in ways that were effectively a demotion without the formal acknowledgement that would have made it visible and arguable. The termination was rarely described as retaliation. That word implies a relationship between the complaint and the consequence that employers in this period denied, often with complete sincerity. The woman was let go because of performance issues, or because the position had been eliminated, or because the office was reorganising, or because she was not, on reflection, a good fit for the role. The complaint she'd made was not mentioned. It did not need to be mentioned. Women who had been through this sequence, who had complained and been disbelieved and then been quietly pushed out, faced a particular kind of aftermath. They had lost their income. They had potentially damaged their professional reputation in ways that would be difficult to recover from in a world where the person providing the reference was the person who had harmed them. And they carried the experience in the particular way that you carry an experience that has been officially denied, not just the original harm, but the additional harm of having the harm declared invisible, of having said what happened and been told in various subtle and unsubtle ways that what happened was not what you thought it was, or was not the kind of thing that warranted a response, or was in some way your own fault. A woman named Paulette Barnes worked for the Environmental Protection Agency in the early 1970s. Her supervisor pursued her persistently, and when she refused him, she was informed that her position was being abolished. She sued, arguing that what had been done to her was a form of sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The courts initially did not know what to do with this argument. Their difficulty was not with the facts as Barnes described them, but with the legal category into which those facts were supposed to fit. Title VII prohibited discrimination based on sex, but the courts had understood sex discrimination to mean differential treatment of women as a class, the wholesale exclusion of women from certain positions, the systematic payment of lower wages. What Barnes was describing was different in form. She'd been denied her livelihood not because she was a woman, in a general sense, but because she was a specific woman who'd refused a specific man's specific demands. The court had to decide whether that constituted discrimination in the legal sense. It eventually decided that it did. But the path to that decision was not easy, and the years it took were years in which other women were in other offices, facing the same question without the law yet having answered it. Let the quiet of this rest with you now. Let the evening come softly over all of it. Her name was Diane Williams. She was young, in her early 20s, and she had recently been hired by the United States Department of Justice as a public information specialist. The year was 1972. She was new to Washington, D.C., new to government work, new to the particular atmosphere of the federal office. Its particular combination of procedural formality and social informality, its protocols and hierarchies, its formal courtesies administered in corridors smelling of industrial carpet and old paper. Washington in 1972 was a city in a particular kind of motion. The Nixon administration was in its second term. The war in Vietnam was winding toward its long end, and the women's movement was well into the years when its ideas were beginning to move from the margins toward the centre of national conversation. Diane Williams was good at her job. She was, by all accounts that survived the legal proceedings that would follow, a competent and conscientious employee who applied herself to her work with the kind of attention that made her worth keeping. She had every reason to expect that her performance would determine her career, that the quality of her work would be the thing that mattered, that she was operating in the kind of professional environment where professional performance was the currency. She was new enough to believe this, or at least to proceed as though she believed it, which in the early days of a new job is perhaps the same thing. Her supervisor was a man named Harvey Brinson. He did not approach her subtly. He proposed directly a romantic and sexual relationship. She declined. She declined not once but repeatedly, over a period of time, as he returned to the subject with a persistence that was itself a form of pressure, the pressure of having to say no again and again, of being required to perform refusal continuously against someone who treated her refusal as something to be overcome rather than something to be respected. The repetition was its own harm, separate from any individual instance. It meant that she could never set down the weight of the refusal, never allow the conversation to be finished and resolved and moved past. The refusal was always temporarily in effect and never permanently settled. When her continued refusals made clear that she would not change her position, the working conditions changed. Her performance evaluations, which had been satisfactory, began to reflect a different assessment. Work that had been considered adequate was now found wanting. Assignments changed in ways that reduced her professional visibility. She was given less interesting work that did not contribute to her advancement, work that kept her occupied without developing her skills or her standing in the organization. The small acknowledgements that constitute the daily currency of professional life, the recognition of good work, the inclusion in relevant meetings, the ordinary courtesies of collegial interaction, became less available to her. These changes were real and specific, and she recognized them for what they were. The connection between the refusals and the deteriorating conditions was not ambiguous to her. She had been there when both things happened. She knew the sequence. She knew that the professional consequences were the professional consequences of the personal refusals, that what was happening to her career was happening because of what she had declined to do outside of it. This knowledge was clear and private, and in the world as it was organized in 1972 largely inactionable. There was no procedure for reporting what was happening. There was no legal category that described it. There was no one to whom she could go and say, "This is happening to me, here is the evidence, here is what I'm asking you to do about it." Eventually she lost her job. She was terminated, the reasons given being her performance, her work not meeting the required standards. She'd been punished, in the most direct sense, not because of what she had failed to do in a professional context, but because of what she had refused to do in a personal one. And she knew this. She knew it the way you know the things that happen to you when you are paying attention, when you are tracking the sequence of cause and effect that the official account is designed to obscure. She was not willing to accept it as a private misfortune, a professional failure, a personal matter between herself and one difficult man in one government office. She sued. She brought a legal action under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. arguing that what had been done to her constituted sex discrimination, that she had been denied equal employment because she had refused to submit to a condition that would not have been imposed on a man in her position. Her argument, reduced to its essential claim, was that the sex was the point. The fact that her employer's demands were sexual in nature was not incidental to the harm done to her. It was the mechanism of the harm. She had been discriminated against as a woman by a man who treated her professional standing as something he was entitled to bargain over in exchange for his sexual interest. The legal system receiving this argument was required to think about something it had not been required to think about before. Was what Brinson had done sex discrimination under the law? Was it the kind of harm that Title VII was designed to address? The District Court, in its 1976 decision written by Judge Charles Ritchie, found in her favour a finding that was significant and carefully reasoned, and represented one of the first times a federal court had recognised that conditioning employment on a woman's response to a supervisor's sexual demands was actionable discrimination based on sex. Judge Ritchie's opinion made an argument that was both simple and, in the legal landscape of the time, novel. He said that what had been done to Diane Williams was discrimination because it derived from her sex, because the condition imposed on her was a condition that could only be imposed on a woman, that arose specifically from the fact of her being a woman in a relationship of professional subordination to a man who found her attractive and believed that her professional standing was his to effect. A male employee in the same position would not have faced the same condition. The condition was therefore discriminatory in the legal sense. It treated her differently because of her sex. The case would be appealed, and the appeal would be decided in her favour as well, in a 1977 ruling from the DC Circuit Court of Appeals that further developed the legal framework she had helped to create. Williams versus Saxby became one of the foundational cases in the legal history of sexual harassment, cited in subsequent decisions, referenced in legal scholarship, built upon by the lawyers and judges who were constructing piece by piece the framework that would eventually be ratified by the Supreme Court. But Diane Williams's story does not end with a legal triumph in the conventional sense. It ends with a young woman who was good at her job, who lost that job because she would not accept conditions that should never have been imposed, and who decided in the face of that injustice to argue in the courts of the United States that what had been done to her was wrong and should be named and addressed. She was right. The law eventually agreed. The office is quiet now. Let her story rest here in the still air of the evening. There is a room at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, sometime in 1974. It is the kind of room that a university of that era contained in abundance, a conference room or seminar space, its walls painted the institutional off-white of academic buildings, its windows looking out on the particular landscape of upstate New York in autumn, hills covered in trees that were going orange and red and gold, the light already shortening by mid-afternoon, the air carrying the particular smell of a region where the changing season is visible on every hillside. The room holds a small number of people. They are women, mostly staff rather than faculty, workers in the university's administrative structures, the people who kept the institution's operations running. They are there to talk. The woman who has brought them together is Lynn Farley. She is teaching at Cornell at this time, a course called Women and Work, which she has designed to examine the conditions of women's professional lives in ways that existing curricula had not examined. The course draws on the experiences of the women who attend it, and those experiences have a pattern that Farley has been noticing and tracking. The women describe things that happen to them in workplaces, the things done to them physically, the things said to them, the conditions placed on their employment, and these descriptions have a coherence that is more than anecdote, more than individual bad luck or individual difficult personalities. They describe a phenomenon, something that happens to women in workplaces systematically, that currently exists in the world without a name. The conversations in that room are careful and sometimes painful. Women describe what has happened to them in their working lives with the particular relief that comes from speaking something that has been held in silence, the relief of discovering that others have held similar things, that the experience is not unique, not a personal failure, not some peculiarity of your specific situation or your specific workplace. The experiences described range across the spectrum from the ambient to the specific, the comments made about appearance, the touching that was never invited, the jokes and the atmosphere of certain offices, and the more direct forms of harm, the conditions placed on employment, the consequences of refusal. Each woman's account is different in its particulars, each is recognizable to the others. The process of finding a name for the phenomenon is not immediate or smooth. Names are chosen carefully because a name shapes what it names, creates a frame that determines what fits inside it and what does not, what is central and what is marginal. A name that is too narrow leaves out important instances of the experience. A name that is too broad becomes difficult to defend legally or institutionally. A name that carries the wrong connotations imports a set of associations that may work against the people it is supposed to help. Lynn Farley and her colleagues think about the name over a period of time, considering various formulations, assessing their implications. The phrase they arrive at is sexual harassment. Two words that do specific work. Sexual, naming the subject matter and indicating its nature, not professional conflict in general, not simply difficulty in the workplace, but something specific to the body and to desire and to the use of desire as a professional instrument, and harassment, naming the quality of the experience, the persistent troubling of a person against their will, the pressure that continues regardless of the refusal that meets it, the quality of something that does not stop when it is asked to stop. The combination is direct and somewhat blunt. It names the thing plainly. It does not soften it with euphemism or complicate it with qualifications. This was a choice, and the choice was deliberate. The first public use of the term came in 1975, when Lynn Farley used it in testimony before the New York City Human Rights Commission. The commission had convened hearings on the conditions of women workers in New York City, and Farley appeared as a witness to describe what she and her colleagues had been documenting. She described the phenomenon, the systematic mistreatment of women in workplaces, the conditions placed on their employment, the harm done to their careers when they refused to comply, and she used the word sexual harassment to describe it. The phrase appeared in the New York Times the following day. It began to circulate. The circulation was not immediate or smooth or linear. Words do not simply enter the language fully formed and immediately effective. They have to be used, argued over, refined, tested in different contexts, adopted by different communities of people who need them for different purposes. Sexual harassment began to appear in legal briefs and academic articles, in women's organization newsletters and newspaper features, in the conversations of women who had been waiting for a way to name what they had experienced. Each use of the word added to its weight and specificity. Each use also attracted resistance, from people who thought the phrase was too broad, too narrow, too activist, too litigious, too personal, not personal enough. What the word did immediately, for the women who heard it and recognized themselves in it, was provide relief of a specific kind. Before the word, a woman who wanted to describe what had happened to her in her workplace had to first construct the context, had to argue for the reality of the experience before she could begin to describe it. She had to establish before anything else that what she was describing was a category of experience rather than an individual incident, that it was systematic rather than accidental, harmful rather than merely awkward. The word did that work for her. It said, "This is a thing. It has a name. Others have experienced it. It is real." The women at Cornell who coined the phrase understood that naming was only a beginning. A name without a legal framework to support it, without institutional structures to implement it, without a cultural vocabulary to receive it, could not by itself change the offices where the experiences it named were continuing to happen. The name was the first move in a longer game, the game of making the law recognize the harm, of making employers take responsibility for preventing it, of making the culture understand that what had been ordinary was not acceptable. The name was necessary but not sufficient, but it was, in the simplest sense, where the change began. Ithaca in autumn is a place of particular beauty. The hills descending to the gorges, the light on the leaves, the way the air carries the first intimation of winter under the scent of the turning season. In that room in that year, women were talking carefully about something that had not been talked about before in that way. They were building something out of words, a category, a framework, a beginning. The room is quiet now, in the way that rooms are quiet after the people have left and the conversation has ended and the words spoken in it are already moving out into the world to do their work. Let the quiet of that room settle over you. Let the autumn light hold everything gently. Rest now. If you're drifting now, let yourself go, Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. In 1976, the magazine Redbook published a survey. Redbook was a women's magazine of the general interest variety, the kind that sat on kitchen tables and in beauty parlours and on the desks of the women who worked in offices, full of recipes and fiction and advice columns and occasional articles about something serious, something that concerned the women who read it, in the way that a real concern becomes a magazine article. When enough people are living it that the editors can reasonably assume their readers will recognise themselves in it. The survey appeared alongside those other contents, embedded in the ordinary fabric of the magazine, directed at ordinary women in ordinary circumstances. The survey asked its readers about their experiences in the workplace. Specifically, it asked about experiences that fell under the newly coined category of sexual harassment. Had they experienced it? What had been done or said? What had happened when they reported it, if they had reported it? How it had affected their work, their careers, their daily experience of going to the office. The survey was printed in the magazine and distributed to a subset of readers through the mail, and the results came back in numbers that surprised even the people who had designed it. 90% of the 9,000 women who responded said that they had experienced some form of sexual harassment in the workplace. 9 in 10. The figure was so large that it seemed almost to exceed the category it was measuring, as though what the survey had found was not a particular experience that happened to many women, but a condition of women's working lives in general, an environmental feature rather than an incident, present everywhere rather than in some places, requiring management rather than exception. The number was striking in its scale and striking in what it implied about the relationship between women and the workplaces they had been occupying for decades. Redbook reported these findings, and they were picked up by newspapers and other publications, and they entered the growing conversation about women and work that was being organised around the new vocabulary. The survey was not a scientific study in the methodological sense. It was self-selected, which meant that the women who responded were those who chose to respond, and those women were likely more affected by the phenomenon than those who did not respond. The number might not represent the population exactly, but even with the methodological caveats applied, the scale was impossible to dismiss. Even half the number would have been enormous. Even a quarter would have described a phenomenon affecting millions of women in American workplaces. What the survey captured, beyond its specific numbers, was the ordinariness of the experience. The women who responded did not describe primarily the most dramatic incidents, the most extreme cases. They described everyday experience. They described the hand on the shoulder and the comment about the hair and the boss who stood too close, and the colleague whose jokes made the room feel different after he had made them. They described the management strategies they had developed, the way they positioned themselves in meetings, the way they handled certain telephone calls, the way they scheduled their days to minimize certain kinds of exposure. They described careers interrupted or ended not by professional failures, but by the consequences of refusing something that should never have been offered. The survey also captured the silence around the experience, and this was perhaps its most revealing finding. Many of the women who responded said they had not reported what had happened to them. Not most, not a small number, but many. The reasons they gave were consistent and practical. They did not think anything would change. They feared losing their jobs. They feared being disbelieved. They feared being blamed. The particular fear that what had happened to them would be reframed as something they had caused or allowed or invited. The familiar logic of a culture that held women responsible for what was done to them. They feared that the act of reporting would create a disruption in their professional lives that would be more costly than the original harm. These were not irrational fears. They were based on what happened to women who did report. The silence was not then the silence of not knowing or not caring. It was the silence of women who had made a specific calculation about the available options and had determined, rationally and correctly given the world as it was, that speaking was unlikely to produce a result proportionate to its cost. This is a particular kind of silence, and it is worth distinguishing from other kinds. It is not the silence of consent. It is not the silence of indifference. It is the silence of a person who has assessed the available remedies and found them inadequate or unavailable, who knows what happened, who carries it, who has decided that the carrying is preferable to the risk of speaking into a world that is not ready to hear it. After the survey, the conversation continued to expand. More surveys were conducted by researchers at universities and advocacy organisations, and they consistently found numbers that, while varying in their specifics, confirmed the Red Book finding in its general shape, that the experience was widespread, that it affected women across industries and age groups and professional levels, that the silence surrounding it was explained by the inadequacy of available remedies rather than by the absence of the experience. More legal cases were filed and decided. More women testified before legislative committees about what they had encountered in their working lives. The conversation was building mass. In the offices themselves, the days continued in their familiar rhythm. The typewriters clattered, the appointment books filled and emptied, the coffee percolated on its schedule. Women came to their desks in the morning and went home in the evening and navigated the hours between with the skills they had developed over years of practice and the strategies they had built out of necessity. Some of them knew about the survey. Some of them had read the articles about the new legal cases. Some of them had heard the word sexual harassment and felt, in the immediate recognition that followed, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. The particular feeling of having a name placed over an experience that has been carried unnamed, of suddenly having language for something that has been real but wordless. The office is very quiet now. The night is coming in. Let the survey's numbers settle into the silence like dust settling after movement. Slowly, finally finding their place. The law does not move quickly. It moves in the particular way of institutions that are designed to be conservative, deliberate, incremental, always referencing what came before, always building new structures on the foundations of earlier ones. This is not a flaw, but a feature. Legal stability depends on precedent, on the accumulation of decisions that can be relied upon and built upon over time, and that accumulation takes time and requires patience. For the women in those offices, the women who were experiencing the thing that had now been named but whose name had not yet been translated into legal obligation, the years of that accumulation were long, many years long, years in which the experience continued while the framework for addressing it was still under construction. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act had been passed in 1964. It prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. The inclusion of sex in the list had been, famously somewhat accidental, introduced as an amendment by a congressman who expected it to sink the bill, who was surprised to find that the bill passed anyway with the amendment intact. The word sex was in the law, a small and specific addition to a list that was otherwise focused on race, and for years its implications were worked out slowly and case by case, in courts that were learning what discrimination on the basis of sex actually meant in the complex reality of American workplaces. The early sex discrimination cases under Title VII focused on the most visible forms of differential treatment. Jobs denied to women because they were women, promotions withheld on the basis of sex, different pay for identical work. These were real and serious harms, and the law began to address them, gradually and with varying degrees of success. But the specific harm of what was beginning to be called sexual harassment presented a different challenge. It was not in the first analysis about women being treated differently as a class, about all women being excluded from certain positions or paid at certain rates. It was about individual women being subjected to individual men's demands in ways that affected their individual careers. The connection to discrimination, to the systematic class-based harm that civil rights law was designed to address, was real, but required a form of analysis that the courts had not yet developed. The courts, in their first attempts to analyse the pattern, resisted the category. They reasoned that what a supervisor did to a secretary was not sex discrimination in the legally cognizable sense. It was the supervisor's private behaviour, unfortunate perhaps, but not the employer's responsibility in the way that employment policies were the employer's responsibility. The employer had not implemented a policy of harassing women. The employer had not intended the harm. The harm was the product of one man's conduct, and connecting that conduct to the broader category of sex discrimination required an analytical step that the early courts declined to take. The harm was real. The court's disinclination to address it was also real. Catherine McKinnon was a law student and then a young lawyer who spent much of the mid-1970s building the argument the courts had been unable to find. She was working on a book that would eventually be published in 1979 under the title Sexual Harassment of Working Women, and in it she constructed a legal and theoretical framework for understanding why sexual harassment in the workplace was a form of sex discrimination under federal law. Her argument was not simple, but its core was that sexual harassment was not the idiosyncratic behavior of individual difficult men, but a systematic use of sexuality as a mechanism for maintaining women's subordinate position in the workplace hierarchy. McKinnon argued that when a man conditioned a woman's employment on her sexual availability, he was exercising a form of power that derived from the structural inequality between men and women in the workplace, from the fact that he was in a position of authority and she was not, from the fact that she needed the job and he could affect her access to it, from the fact that the entire arrangement encoded an inequality of power that was itself the product of sex discrimination in its broadest sense. The harm was not incidental to the employment relationship. It was embedded in it. It was made possible by the same structures that made all other forms of workplace discrimination possible. She also developed a distinction between two categories of harassment that would prove foundational in subsequent legal analysis. The first was quid pro quo harassment, the explicit or implicit condition placed on employment or advancement, the demand that acceptance of sexual conduct was the price of keeping one's job or being promoted. This was the Diane Williams pattern, the Paulette Barnes pattern, the direct conditioning of professional outcomes on personal compliance. It was legally the simpler case because the causal connection between the conduct and the professional harm was direct and demonstrable. The second category McKinnon described was what she called hostile environment harassment, the creation of a workplace atmosphere so permeated with sexual conduct, comments, images, physical contact, that it materially altered the conditions of employment for the women working in it, making the workplace hostile or abusive in a way that interfered with a person's ability to do her job. This was a more complex category because it required the recognition that harm could be cumulative rather than incident-specific, that a workplace could be harmful, not because of any single act that crossed a clear line, but because of an accumulating atmosphere of conduct that, taken together, constituted a material change in working conditions. The single comment might be trivial, the 1,000 comments were not. The hostile environment theory was the more contested of the two, and it took longer for the courts to accept. It required accepting that the working environment itself could be the harm, not just specific incidents within it, but the general condition created by specific incidents. And this was a more sophisticated and demanding analytical framework than the quid pro quo case. It was also, for the women who had been living in those offices, the more accurate description of their experience. The harm of sexual harassment was not primarily the dramatic incident. It was the daily condition of working in a place where certain things were permitted, where the atmosphere made certain forms of contact and certain kinds of language normal, where vigilance was required as a constant background process. McKinnon's framework gave this experience a legal shape. The shape would eventually be ratified by the Supreme Court. The building of the law was also the building of something else, a community of people, lawyers, advocates, scholars, and the women whose experiences provided the material, who were working together on the same project. They knew each other's cases. They cited each other's briefs and articles. They developed arguments in conversation, testing formulations against each other and against the court's responses, refining the framework over years of practice. The legal development of sexual harassment doctrine was not the work of one person or one case. It was a collective project built incrementally over years by people who understood that they were building something new and that building required patience and persistence and the willingness to fail in one case and try again in the next. Let the long work of building rest in the quiet now. Let the night hold it gently. In 1980, a film was released that became one of the highest-grossing pictures of the year. It was called 9 to 5, and it starred Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, and Dolly Parton as three secretaries who decide, after a particularly terrible day, to take matters into their own hands regarding the boss who's made their working lives a combination of tedium, indignity, and calculated harm. The film was a comedy, broad and bright and full of the particular pleasure of watching people who have been pushed too far finally push back, with a thoroughness that real life never quite permits. The fantasy sequences were vivid and cathartic. The ending was happy in the way that endings in comedies are happy. Resolution, vindication, justice. If not the complicated and incomplete justice of the real world, then the clean, satisfying justice of a story that is allowed to end at the right moment. Audiences loved it. They lined up around the block to see it. They laughed in the particular way that audiences laugh when something on screen speaks to something real in their lives. The laugh that is also recognition, also a release of something that has been held, also the particular relief of being told by the existence of a major studio comedy that you are not alone, and that the thing you've been managing is visible enough to be worth a story. The film's popularity was not an accident. It was the product of a cultural moment in which the experiences it depicted had accumulated enough visibility, enough vocabulary, enough institutional recognition that a major Hollywood production could assume its audience would understand immediately what was being depicted and why it mattered. Jane Fonda had been involved in the labour organising that preceded and accompanied the film. She had worked with 9 to 5, a real organisation of working women founded in Boston in the early 1970s by Karen Nussbaum and Vicky Donahue, and a group of women who had met at Radcliffe College while working secretarial jobs. The organisation had grown out of the recognition that the particular conditions of secretarial and clerical work, the low pay, the limited advancement, the specific quality of being professionally essential and professionally overlooked, constituted a set of labour issues that existing unions had not adequately addressed. The organisation focused on the economic dimensions of the problem, on pay equity and promotion, and the formal structure of workplace rights, but it also documented the experiential dimensions, the daily texture of working in these conditions, the specific forms of disrespect and harm that were woven into the fabric of the working day. The connection between the film and the organising movement was important because it illustrated the relationship between cultural expression and political work, the way that comedy and art can make visible and speakable what political organising has been building the framework to address. Millions of people who had not followed the legal cases or read the Red Book survey or heard Lynn Farley testify before the Human Rights Commission went to see 9 to 5 and understood, through laughter, something about the working world that they might not have been able to absorb in a more earnest form. The comedy was not less serious for being funny. In some ways it was more serious. It reached people who would not have read the law review articles, people who went to films on Friday evenings and came away with something they hadn't had before. For the women who worked in those offices, who recognised their own desks and their own bosses and their own daily calculations in the film's characters and situations, the experience was something more specific than entertainment. It was recognition of the intense and validating kind, the recognition that says not only you are not alone, but that what you have been living is visible, is common, is real enough to be the subject of a story that millions of people will understand without explanation. The film told them that what they had been managing was not invisible, not merely personal, not some peculiarity of their specific situation. It was a condition of their working world, and it was being shown to the whole country, and the whole country was laughing the laugh of recognition. Lily Tomlin played the long-time employee, the woman who had been doing the job for years with competence and dedication, who had trained the men who were promoted above her, who had absorbed the office's injustices with the professional equanimity that the guides prescribed and that experience had taught. Dolly Parton played the boss's secretary, the woman who was the direct object of his pursuit, who had to manage his unwanted attention in the context of professional dependence. Jane Fonda played the newcomer, the woman who arrived without the protective calluses of long experience, and therefore saw clearly what the others had learned to manage without seeing. The three of them, together, represented something like the full range of secretarial experience, the long-term, the directly targeted, and the newly arrived. Their boss was played by Dabney Coleman with a kind of gleeful awfulness that served the comedy without quite making the character cartoonish. He was recognisable as a type, not a monster in the cinematic sense, not someone whose behaviour was extreme enough to be dismissed as exceptional, but a specific and recognisable species of ordinary institutional bad actor, the man who used his position to take what he wanted from the people below him, who accepted the perquisites of his authority as naturally as he accepted his salary, who had never been given any reason by the world around him to believe that what he was doing was wrong. The horror of him was not his extremity, but his ordinariness. The 9 to 5 organisation itself continued to grow after the film's release. It became a national organisation with chapters in cities across the country, training women in the language of their workplace rights, helping them navigate complaint processes, documenting cases of retaliation, pushing for legal and policy changes at the state and federal level. It operated in the important and difficult space between the individual woman at her desk and the institutional structures that were slowly being built to protect her, the space where most of the real work of change happens, in the patient and largely unglamorous work of organising people to understand their situation and take action on that understanding. The film ended happily. Real life ended differently, more slowly, more partially, without the clean resolution of the final scene. But real life was moving, in its slow and uneven way, towards something different from what had been the norm. The offices of 1980 were not the offices of 1960. The vocabulary existed now. The legal framework was developing. The culture was shifting, not quickly, not completely, not without continuous resistance, but shifting. And in the shifting there was the accumulated weight of thousands of women's experiences, named and unnamed, reported and unreported, carried in offices through decades that had not yet made their lives fully safe, but that were, at least beginning to. Let the movie end here, in the good feeling of the final scene. The impossible clean resolution that life does not quite provide, but that movies allow. The vindication that takes 2 hours instead of 2 decades. Let the warmth of that ending rest with you. The office in the film is quiet now. The boss is gone. The women are still there at their desks in the fluorescent light. The typewriters are still. The night is coming. Let it come gently. Not every woman could leave. This is perhaps the simplest and most important fact about the working world of the 1960s and 1970s, and it is the fact that most clearly explains the scale of what women endured during those decades and the particular quality of that endurance. The women who sued, the women who testified, the women who organised and advocated and eventually changed the law, they existed within a much larger population of women who had no real option but to stay, to manage, to find ways of continuing in environments that harmed them, because the alternative was an economic precariousness they could not afford. The calculus was not abstract. It was the specific arithmetic of rent and groceries and school fees and utility bills, the monthly accounting of what was needed against what was available. A woman with children, a woman whose husband's income was insufficient, through his own insufficiency or illness or absence, a woman who was supporting a parent who could no longer work, or a sibling in difficulty, or herself alone in a city where the wages available to women outside of professional office work were lower still. For these women, the choice between staying and leaving was not a choice in the meaningful sense. It was a series of options with very different costs, weighted by practical necessity, in a way that made leaving effectively impossible. To leave was to lose income that was essential. To find another job was to enter another office in another company, with the same ambient conditions, because the conditions were not specific to one office or one company. They were the furniture of the working world, present everywhere, because they arose from arrangements of power that were everywhere the same. The women who stayed developed strategies. They were not passive in their endurance. Passivity would not have gotten them through the days. They were active, continuously assessing, continuously adjusting, continuously managing the space between what was being done to them and what they were able to do in response, within the constraints of a world that offered them very limited tools. A strategy might be as simple as the placement of one's body in a room, always near the door, always with a clear path to leave a situation, never caught in a position from which extraction would require explanation. It might be the management of eye contact, the calibration of directness against avoidance, the particular quality of attention that was professional without being inviting. It might be the careful management of one's appearance, the calculation of how to present oneself in a way that was professional and appropriate, without offering any surface that could be commented on or touched. The secretarial guides had told women to dress appropriately, to be neat and feminine without being conspicuous. Women who were navigating workplaces that were not safe had to add layers to this calculation, to think not only about professional appropriateness but about the specific signals that different choices of clothing or hairstyle sent in the context of the specific office they were in, the specific dynamics they were managing. This was an additional expenditure of cognitive resources on a problem that should not have existed, performed in the time and attention that might otherwise have gone to the work itself. It might be the cultivation of alliances, the informal networks of mutual protection that women built among themselves in offices where no formal protection was available. A woman at a nearby desk who understood the dynamics and could be counted on to appear with a question at a critical moment. A receptionist who knew when certain calls needed to be routed urgently. A colleague in another department who could create a reason for an unexpected encounter that would interrupt a situation before it progressed. These alliances were not discussed in the formal structures of the office. They were developed informally, communicated in the private language of shared experience, maintained by the kind of loyalty that arises between people who are navigating the same difficult terrain together. The friendships that developed in those offices were real, and they were meaningful in ways that went beyond the strategic. Women who worked together for years, who ate lunch together, who rode the elevator together, who navigated the same difficult mornings and the same long afternoons, developed a closeness that was sustained in part by the shared experience of managing the same conditions. The knowledge that someone near you understood what you were carrying, that you did not have to explain it or prove it or argue for its reality, was its own form of relief. The friendships were the best thing about the work, and also the product of conditions that made them necessary in a way they should not have been necessary. There were also women who, for reasons of temperament or circumstance, or simply the specific characteristics of their situation, found ways to resist more directly, not through legal action, which was not available to most women in that period, but through the exercise of a specific kind of authority that was available to them within the constraints of the existing structure. A woman who had developed, over years, such a formidable professional reputation that approaching her in certain ways would have cost the approacher more than it could gain. A woman who had cultivated relationships with powerful clients or with other executives in the organization in ways that gave her a form of protection. Not formal protection, not legal protection, but the practical protection of being someone whose departure or distress would create problems for people whose problems the organization preferred to avoid. A woman who simply did not make the adjustment, who received a certain kind of comment with such perfect blandness, such absolute failure to register the intended meaning, that continuing became too effortful for the person making it. This was a specific skill, the cultivation of impenetrability, of a professional surface so smoothly unresponsive that it offered no purchase for the kind of approach it was designed to deflect. Women who are good at this describe it as exhausting to maintain, as a performance that required constant attention, but also as effective in ways that other strategies were not, because it worked not by confronting the problem directly, which created its own risks, but by making the problem unrewarding to pursue. The women who stayed were the majority. They were also, in the historical record, the least visible. The legal cases produced documents, produced names, produced arguments that could be cited and built upon. The organizing produced archives and publications, but the daily endurance of women who managed without suing, who navigated without organizing, who got through the decades without their stories entering any formal record, that endurance mostly left only the lives it produced, which were not always happy but were persistent, and which persisted long enough to see the world around them slowly change. Their persistence was not passivity. It was a form of work, continuous, difficult, skillful, performed without support or acknowledgement, in the service of their own survival and the survival of the people who depended on them. The history of workplace safety for women is usually told through its legal and institutional milestones, through the cases won and the laws passed and the policies implemented. But those milestones rose out of a longer, quieter history. The history of the women who kept the offices running through decades that asked too much of them, who brought their whole competence and their whole self-management to workplaces that did not recognize what they were receiving. They are worth remembering. The night is quiet around them now. Let them rest. Silence is not a passive state. It is produced and maintained by specific conditions, specific incentives, specific structures of consequence that make speaking more costly than not speaking. This is true in general, and it was true with particular force in the American office of the 1960s and 1970s, where the silence around the experiences of women workers was not the silence of ignorance or indifference, but the silence of calculation. The careful, rational decision of women who had assessed the available options and determined that speaking would not produce a result proportionate to its cost. The silence was a response to a world that had made speaking dangerous. Understanding the mechanics of that silence is important for understanding why the harm continued as long as it did. One of the primary mechanics was the reference letter. When a woman left a job, whether she left voluntarily, was terminated, or was pushed out by conditions that made staying impossible, she needed a reference. The reference was the bridge between her current employment and whatever came next, the document or telephone call that conveyed to a prospective employer the measure of her professional worth. References were not merely formal requirements, they were, in many industries and many positions, the most important determinant of whether a woman could find comparable work after leaving a position. A strong reference opened doors, a weak one closed them, a damaging one could end a career trajectory. The reference was held by the employer she was leaving. An employer who had behaved badly and been complained about, or who had terminated a woman in retaliation for refusing him, controlled the account that would go to her next prospective employer. He did not need to say anything overtly damaging, a carefully worded statement of limited enthusiasm, a tepid description of her skills that stopped conspicuously short of the positive language prospective employers expected, a notable omission of the kind of warm professional endorsement that signals genuine satisfaction. Any of these could accomplish the practical effect of a negative reference without creating a paper trail that could be easily characterized as retaliation. Women understood this dynamic, and the understanding shaped their decisions before they made them. When a woman was weighing whether to report something that had been done to her, the reference letter was one of the weights on the silence side of the scale. The question was not only whether reporting would address the immediate harm, whether the complaint would be believed, whether the behavior would be stopped, whether anything would change, but also what would happen to her career after she reported. The reference letter was part of that calculation. It was a practical constraint on speech that operated before the speech occurred, shaping the decision to speak or not speak in ways that were invisible to the people it was protecting. Another mechanic of silence was the culture of professional loyalty and discretion that the offices themselves enforced. The secretarial guides had described this culture approvingly. The professional who did not gossip, who did not discuss office matters with outsiders, who carried the secrets of the workplace with the discretion of a confessor. This culture was legitimate in many of its applications. There were real reasons for employees not to leak confidential business information, not to damage their employers' relationships with clients through indiscreet conversation. But the principle of discretion had a broader application in practice, one that extended beyond business confidentiality to the behavior of individuals within the workplace. What happened in the office was office business. This was a norm that was rarely stated explicitly, because norms that operate most effectively tend not to need explicit statement. They are simply the way things are, absorbed through socialization rather than instruction. The office was a sealed world, and what happened inside it remained inside it, and this norm applied as much to the conduct of managers and supervisors as to the conduct of business transactions. A woman who discussed what had been done to her with someone outside the office, a friend, a family member, a counsellor, was in some technical sense violating the implicit professional culture of the office. The violation was never legally enforceable, but the violation was felt, and the feeling of it contributed to the silence. The physical architecture of the office was also a mechanic of silence in a more literal sense. The private office, the closed door, these were features of the working environment that created the conditions of concealment that made certain behaviours possible. What happened behind a closed door was available to no witness outside the room. There was no record of it beyond the memories of the people present, and those memories, in the event of a dispute, would be weighted by the institutional standing of the people who held them. Her account and his account of what had happened in the room were not institutionally equivalent. His position in the organisation, his relationships with the people who would evaluate the competing accounts, his professional standing and its backing, all of these gave his account a kind of default credibility that hers did not automatically possess. The credibility differential was perhaps the most fundamental mechanic of silence, because it operated not after the speaking had occurred, but in anticipation of it. A woman deciding whether to report what had happened knew, from the stories of other women, from the general cultural understanding of how these situations were received, that her account would be evaluated against his, and that the evaluation would not begin from a neutral baseline. He was the professional in good standing. She was the person making a claim that disrupted his standing. The disruption created a presumption of error on her part, not because anyone had made a deliberate decision to presume her wrong, but because the disruption itself required explanation, and the most comfortable explanation, for the people in the organisation who would receive the complaint, was that she had misunderstood or misrepresented. These mechanics, the reference letter, the culture of discretion, the closed door, the credibility differential, created a system that was self-reinforcing. Each element supported the others, and together they created an environment in which the incentives for speaking were low and the costs were high, and in which the rational response to harm was often silence. The system was not designed as a system. No one had sat down and planned these elements to work together in this way. They had grown out of existing arrangements of power, and had developed over time into a coherent structure, as coherent in its effects as anything that had been deliberately designed. What eventually weakened the system was the same process that had created the conditions for weakening any structure of concealment: the accumulation of evidence. The legal cases, the surveys, the testimonies, the academic research, all of this was evidence that the system existed, that it operated as described, that the silence it produced was manufactured rather than natural, that the harm it concealed was real and widespread. Evidence of this kind, accumulated over years, eventually created the conditions for legal and institutional change. The change was slow. The years of accumulation were long, but the silence was not permanent. It had mechanics, and mechanics can be understood, and understanding is the beginning of dismantling. Let the quiet of the night hold all of this. Let the weight of it settle and release. The morning is still far away. In 1986, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case called Merita Savings Bank v. Vinson. The decision was unanimous. 9 justices, across the range of political appointments that constituted the court at that time, agreed on the essential holding that sexual harassment in the workplace was a form of sex discrimination prohibited by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The legal framework that had been built over more than a decade, through the cases of Diane Williams and Paulette Barnes and the dozens of women whose accounts had moved through the lower courts in the years since 1972, through the scholarship of Catherine McKinnon and the advocacy of Lynn Farley and the organising of 9 to 5, was now ratified at the highest level of federal law. The word coined in 1975 in a seminar room in Ithaca was now embedded in the constitutional jurisprudence of the United States. The case concerned a woman named Michelle Vinson, who had worked at a bank in Washington, D.C. She had been hired by a man named Sidney Taylor, the vice president and branch manager of the bank, who had hired her and became her supervisor. Over the course of 4 years, she had been subjected to a pattern of conduct that was sustained and severe: unwanted touching, repeated demands, a persistent harassment that she endured because she feared the consequences of refusing and because she had nowhere to turn within the institutional structures of the bank. When her employment was eventually terminated, she filed suit. The case raised directly the question that the lower courts had been working around for a decade. Did sexual harassment constitute actionable sex discrimination under Title VII? The Supreme Court's answer was yes, unambiguously, on both of the categories that McKinnon had identified. Quid pro quo harassment, the direct conditioning of employment on acceptance of sexual conduct, was sex discrimination. Hostile environment harassment, the creation of a working environment so permeated with unwanted sexual conduct that it materially altered the conditions of employment, was also sex discrimination. Both categories were legally actionable. Employers could be held liable for both. McKinnon had argued the case alongside Vinson's attorneys, and the victory was, among other things, the vindication of a legal theory that she had spent years developing and defending against objections from courts and commentators who had found various reasons to resist it. The court's reasoning tracked the arguments she had made in her scholarship, that the harm of sexual harassment was discriminatory in nature because it derived from the structural inequality of women in the workplace, because it was a harm that was disproportionately and systematically suffered by women in their capacity as women employees, and because it was made possible by the same arrangements of power that made all other forms of workplace sex discrimination possible. The decision was a landmark in the legal sense, a decision that changed the law in ways that were immediately significant and that established a precedent that would shape every subsequent case in the area. But a landmark decision is not a transformation of the world. It is a point in a longer process, a moment at which the formal law catches up partially to a reality that has been developing for years. The decision answered some questions and raised others. What precisely constituted a hostile environment? How severe did the conduct have to be to cross the legal threshold? What obligations did employers have to prevent harassment, and what consequences followed from their failure to do so? These questions would be worked out in subsequent cases, in a continuing legal conversation that extended well beyond 1986. The working world did not immediately transform itself after Merita. The legal liability that the decision established created incentives for employers to implement policies and training programs that had not previously existed. Human resources departments that had had no formal framework for receiving harassment complaints were given the tools and the institutional motivation to build one. Workplace policies began to be written that defined prohibited conduct, described reporting procedures, and specified the consequences for violations. These changes were real and in many offices represented a genuine improvement in the formal structures available to women who experienced harassment. They were also imperfect in ways that became clear over time. A policy written on paper is not the same as a culture in which that policy is taken seriously. A training program that teaches employees to recognize the legal definitions of harassment is not the same as a workplace where the social norms have changed in ways that make harassment less likely to occur. The formal structures that followed from Meritor were necessary but not sufficient. The gap between the formal structure and the lived reality of workplaces remained considerable, in enough places for enough years, to allow significant harm to continue even within a legal framework that nominally prohibited it. What Meritor and its aftermath had done at minimum was to alter the fundamental structure of the conversation. Before the decision, the question of whether sexual harassment was a legal harm, whether the law recognized it as a category of experience warranting redress, was still open. After the decision, that question was settled at the level of federal constitutional law. Women who experienced harassment had a legal framework within which to bring their claims. Employers had a legal obligation to prevent and address it. The terms of the conversation had changed, even if the reality of workplaces had not changed as thoroughly or as quickly as the decision's scope might have suggested. The secretarial pool, as an institution, was already disappearing by the time Meritor was decided. Personal computers were transforming the nature of office work in ways that made large pools of typists unnecessary. The executives who had relied on secretaries to type all their correspondence were beginning to type it themselves. The specific institutional arrangement that had organized clerical labor in the post-war decades was dissolving into a different configuration of work, one that was less clearly gendered in its structure even as it continued to replicate gendered arrangements in other forms. The offices were changing. The conditions in them were changing. Slowly, with resistance, but changing. And through all of it, the women who had worked in those offices of the 1960s and 1970s were growing older. The women who had managed the difficult years, who had navigated the conditions that the law had not yet named, were now in their 40s and 50s, watching the legal framework being built that had not been available to them when they needed it. Some of them had left their secretarial careers behind. Some had stayed, had risen as far as the structures of their organizations permitted, had become the senior women in offices that were slowly learning to treat them differently. They watched the world change around them with the particular feeling of people who have survived the conditions that made the change necessary, a feeling that contains both satisfaction and grief, both vindication and the knowledge of how long the vindication took. Let the late hour hold all of this. The world is quiet. Rest now. There is a photograph, taken somewhere in the late 1970s, of a group of women standing outside a building in what looks like winter weather. They are holding hand-lettered signs. The signs make demands about pay and workplace rights and the conditions of clerical work. The women look cold, their coats are buttoned, their breath is visible in the air around them, but they are smiling in the particular way of people who are doing something together, something chosen and difficult and meaningful, something that has brought them into the street on a cold day because the office was not offering them what they needed. They are not famous. Their names do not appear in the history books. But they were there, in that photograph, in that cold, and in the long accounting of how the world changes, they count. What remains of that period, the decades of the 1960s and 1970s in American offices, the years before the word existed, the years when the word was being constructed and deployed and argued over? What remains of the experience of the women who went to those desks every morning in a world that had not yet decided their experience deserved a name or a remedy? What remains is several things, held in different forms, persisting with different degrees of clarity. What remains, first, is the law, the framework that was constructed over more than 2 decades, beginning with the legal actions of women like Diane Williams and Paulette Barnes, continuing through the scholarship of Catherine McKinnon and the advocacy of Lynn Farley, arriving at the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Merita and the subsequent development of doctrine, exists in the legal record with a permanence that the experiences it was built from do not have. The cases are there to be read, the arguments are there to be studied, the holdings are there to be cited and applied in the cases that continue to arise in workplaces that continue to present the same fundamental dynamics in different forms. Women in workplaces today have legal protections that the women of the 1960s did not have. These protections are real, even if they are imperfect in application, even if the gap between the formal law and the lived experience of workplaces remains considerable, even if the existence of a legal framework does not by itself guarantee that women are safe in the offices where they work. The protections exist because specific women in specific circumstances decided to bring the harm they had experienced before the law and ask the law to recognize it. The law was slow to respond, and its responses were incomplete, and the women who initiated the process often did not see satisfying personal outcomes from it. But they built something that outlasted their individual cases, something that is still being used and still being developed and still protecting people, imperfectly, partially, with all the limitations of legal protection in an imperfect world. What remains, second, is the vocabulary. The words sexual harassment have now been in common use for 5 decades, embedded in workplace policies and legal documents and news coverage, and the ordinary conversations of people trying to make sense of their working lives. The vocabulary does not guarantee the experience will be addressed when it occurs, but it changes the conditions under which the experience can be spoken about, and spoken about differently than it was before the vocabulary existed. It gives people who have experienced something a way to name it, and naming, as the women of Cornell understood when they chose the phrase, is not a trivial act. It is the prerequisite for everything else, for reporting, for organizing, for legislating, for the slow process of cultural change that depends on people being able to speak plainly about what they have experienced. What remains, third, is the memory, held in the specific and irreplaceable form of individual experience. The women who worked through those decades are older now, and some of them are gone. Their working lives, the specific texture of the days, the smell of the office in the morning, the particular quality of the vigilance required, the friendships that sustained them, the strategies they developed, mostly exist only in their memories and in the memories of the people they told. The historical record is incomplete, as it always is when it comes to the experience of ordinary people who did not hold institutional power. The women of the secretarial pools, the private secretaries, the receptionists, they are underrepresented in the archives in the same proportion that they were underrepresented in the professional hierarchies they served. But the memory persists, carried in the particular form that lived experience takes, not archived, not recorded, not formally preserved, but real and present in the bodies and minds of people who were there. A woman in her 70s who went to work in an office in 1963 carries in herself the memory of what those years required, the specific weight of it, the quality of the adjustment, the relief of 5 o'clock, the warmth of the women who understood. She knows what it was like. She was there. And in her knowing, something of the period persists that no document quite captures. The texture of ordinary days in a world that was not safe enough, navigated by women who were not complaining but were not accepting, who were doing what was necessary while waiting, sometimes without knowing they were waiting for the world to change. What also remains is the incompleteness. The story does not end in any decade yet reached. The legal framework continues to be tested and developed. The cultural norms around acceptable workplace behavior continue to evolve, sometimes quickly, in the way of a cultural moment when long-accumulated pressures find a sudden release, sometimes slowly, in the way of deep structural arrangements that resist surface-level change. The particular relationship between power and gender in professional life continues to produce situations that would be immediately recognizable to the women who worked in those 1960s offices, even though the specific forms they take have changed in ways those women would not have predicted. What the women of that period left behind was not a solved problem. They left a named one. They left a problem with a vocabulary and a legal category, and a framework for understanding what it is and why it is harmful, and what might be done about it. That is not nothing. It is, in the long history of harm and its recognition, something genuinely significant. The difference between a harm that is invisible and one that is visible, between an experience that is unspeakable and one that can be spoken, between a condition that cannot be challenged and one that can. The naming was the beginning. The beginning was enough to set in motion a process that, over decades, changed the working world in ways that are real even when they are incomplete. The office in the photograph is quiet now. The women with their signs have gone inside or gone home. The building stands as it stood before, its windows holding the grey light of a winter afternoon, its floors holding the desks and the typewriters and the filing cabinets and all the ordinary furniture of a working world. But something has changed in the building. Not in its structure, not in its walls and its windows, but in the invisible arrangement of what is acceptable within it, in the understanding of what women are entitled to when they come to work in the morning. The change is real. The change is incomplete. The change is the product of the women who made it, slowly, over years, in the offices and the courts and the streets, in the patient work of building a world that is better than the one they inherited. Let the cold air of the photograph settle into something warmer. Let the day end. Let everything rest. You arrive before 8. The building's lobby is already busy, elevator doors opening and closing, the lobby guard nodding to familiar faces, the particular smell of a large building in the morning, floor wax and radiator warmth, and the cold that has come in off the street on people's coats and hasn't quite dissipated yet. You press the button for the 6th floor. The elevator is panelled in brushed steel, and it moves slowly, and in the polished surface you can see a distorted reflection of yourself, your coat, your handbag, the careful arrangement of your hair. You watch the numbers change above the door and think about the day's schedule, which you reviewed before you left home, which you carry in your mind the way a musician carries a piece they are about to perform. The 6th floor is not yet fully populated when you arrive. The cleaners have been and gone. The ashtrays are empty, the wastebaskets emptied, the surfaces wiped to a particular institutional cleanliness that will be undone by noon and restored again tomorrow before anyone arrives. You hang your coat on the hook in the small cloakroom off the main corridor and arrange your handbag in your desk drawer. You open the appointment book to today's date and read through it the way a conductor reads a score, following the flow of the day's events, marking the moments of transition and the requirements each appointment will create. 9 o'clock. Call with the Chicago office, which means you will need the folder labelled Chicago Correspondence from the second drawer of the filing cabinet, which you locate now and set on the corner of your desk. 10:30. A meeting with a client whose name requires a particular pronunciation that you have practiced, whose preferences for coffee you have noted in the small personal detail section of the appointment file. The coffee is your first task. The percolator is in the kitchen at the end of the corridor, and you fill it at the sink and measure the coffee with the particular attention that this specific percolator requires. It runs slightly hot and makes the coffee bitter. If you use the standard measure, so you use slightly less, a calibration you arrived at after the first 2 weeks of making it wrong and then making it right. The percolator hums to life and begins its particular smell, and you return to your desk as the morning begins its slow accumulation of small tasks. The mail arrives before 8:30. The overnight mail is already in the basket, 3 letters, 2 memos, and a small package addressed to your employer that you set to one side, separate from the correspondence that requires your attention. You open each letter with the silver opener that lives in the top right drawer of your desk, a small and precise instrument that you use with the efficiency of long practice. The contents of each envelope are assessed in a matter of seconds. This one requires a response, this one requires filing, this one requires your employer's immediate attention, this one requires nothing because it is a solicitation that will be disposed of. By the time the regular mail arrives at 9, you have processed the overnight material and your desk has the particular orderly look of a morning that is already being managed. Your employer arrives at 9:15. You know his step in the corridor, the particular weight and cadence of it, and you have arranged yourself in the right attitude of readiness before he reaches the door. You greet him in the way that has been established over the months of working together, the professional courtesy that is warm enough to be pleasant and formal enough to maintain the appropriate distance. You inform him of the morning's schedule as he settles into the outer office briefly before moving through to his own room. The Chicago folder is ready. The coffee is made. The appointment book is open to the right page. Everything is as it should be. He nods and goes through the door, and you hear him settle at his desk, and the morning is officially in motion. The morning passes in the rhythm of the schedule you prepared. The Chicago call goes through at 9 o'clock and lasts 40 minutes rather than the scheduled 30, which requires a small adjustment to the morning's subsequent arrangements that you accomplish without comment or visible effort. The 10:30 meeting arrives, and the client whose name requires the practiced pronunciation arrives in the lobby and is announced by the receptionist and escorted to the conference room where the necessary materials have already been arranged. You're not in the meeting, you're at your desk handling the calls that need handling, the correspondence that needs addressing, the ongoing management of the day's requirements. There is a satisfaction in this work when it goes well, the particular satisfaction of a complex system operating smoothly, of many small tasks aligning into a functioning whole. It is not a satisfaction that is easy to articulate to people who have not experienced it. It does not have the visible drama of the satisfactions available in other kinds of work, but it is real. The morning that has unfolded without interruption, that has met its requirements and managed its complications and delivered the executive to his meetings with everything he needed. That is a small and genuine achievement, and the women who produced it knew it. What the morning does not contain, in the smooth official version, is the other work, the work of navigating the office's social atmosphere, the management of the ambient conditions that are part of the working environment, and are not mentioned in the appointment book. The comment made in passing, the touch that is brief and unremarkable to the person who makes it, the moment in the kitchen when a colleague says something that requires a specific kind of non-response. These things happen in the interstices of the official schedule, in the spaces between the tasks, and they require a portion of the day's attention that is never formally acknowledged but is always drawn upon. The morning that looks smooth from the outside has layers that are visible only from the inside, from the position of the woman who is managing all of them simultaneously. By noon, the morning is done. The letters that needed typing are typed. The phone calls that needed making are made. The filing is complete, or will be complete before the afternoon meetings begin. You eat lunch at the luncheonette around the corner with the woman from the desk nearest yours, and for an hour the office is not the reference point of the conversation, or it is the reference point in the way that things are discussed between people who share them, candidly, privately, in the register of mutual understanding that does not need to perform anything for anyone. And then you walk back through the lobby and press the button for the 6th floor, and the afternoon begins. The office ran on a formal economy, salaries, titles, organizational charts, the official distribution of authority and responsibility that was printed in the company handbook and posted on the wall outside the personnel office. But it also ran on an informal economy, one that was never printed anywhere and was not acknowledged in official documents, but that was real and consequential and shaped the working lives of everyone in the building in ways that the formal economy could not fully account for. This was the economy of favour, of approval and disapproval, of inclusion and exclusion, of the small daily recognitions that constitute a person's standing in a social group. In this informal economy, the secretary occupied a particular position. She had very little formal power, no authority over anyone else, no budget control, no decision-making capacity in the organisational sense. But she had considerable informal power of a specific kind. She was the person through whom her employer's attention and access were mediated. She knew which calls got through and which were held. She knew which visitors were announced immediately and which were made to wait. She knew the schedule and the priorities and the internal politics of the office, and her management of them shaped other people's access to the things they needed. Other employees understood this, and many of them cultivated their relationship with the secretary accordingly. The person who treated the secretary well, who said good morning, and remembered her name and asked after her family, and brought back a small something from the department's lunch if she hadn't been invited, was the person who found that calls were sometimes returned more promptly, that certain messages were delivered with an emphasis that others didn't receive, that the small institutional frictions of daily office life were smoothed rather than multiplied. The person who treated the secretary as furniture, as a function rather than a person, as the extension of an office rather than the human being who staffed it, often found that the informal economy was less reliably generous to them. This was informal power, and it was real, and many secretaries exercised it with a discretion that was itself a form of skill. It was not power that could be made explicit. You could not say that you were withholding something in retaliation for poor treatment, because to say it would be to make visible what needed to remain invisible, to challenge the formal hierarchy in a way that would not be tolerated. It was power that operated through the small daily choices that no one else noticed, that accumulated over time into real effects on other people's professional lives. It was the power available to people who have been assigned no power in the formal sense, found in the margins, exercised carefully, a form of agency in a situation designed to provide very little of it. But the informal economy also contained the conditions that made secretaries vulnerable. The same proximity to the executive's attention that gave the secretary informal power also created specific risks. She was, by virtue of her position, in frequent and close contact with a man who had formal authority over her professional standing. The daily meetings, the dictation sessions, the closed-door moments that were a normal part of her working life. These created the conditions for the kind of conduct that was harming women in offices across the country. The informal economy that included the secretary's small agencies also included the executive's larger ones. The executive who wanted to make certain demands of his secretary had available to him the full toolkit of the informal economy: the favourable performance review, the good reference, the inclusion in interesting projects, the salary increase that was discretionary rather than automatic. He had the power to make her working life better or worse in ways that were real and specific and largely invisible to anyone outside the immediate relationship. And she had the knowledge that these things were within his control, that her access to them was, in the informal economy of the office, partly a function of how she navigated the relationship with him. This was the structure that made the harm possible, not any individual man's particular disposition, not any specific office's unique culture, but the fundamental structure of the relationship, the combination of proximity and dependency, and the discretionary informal power that flowed in both directions, but flowed far more strongly from the executive toward the secretary than in the other direction. The woman who said no to her boss was saying no to the person who controlled, in ways that were often informal and therefore difficult to document, significant aspects of her professional future. The no was always given in that context. The context made it more costly. Women who navigated these structures successfully often described the experience as one of continuous, sophisticated social management, reading the informal signals with the same attention they brought to their formal duties, managing the emotional atmosphere of the office with the same skill they brought to managing the appointment book. They were, in effect, doing two jobs simultaneously: the job that appeared in their job description, and the job that the informal economy required and that no one had told them they were being hired to do. The second job was never acknowledged, never compensated, never formally recognized. It was simply the additional requirement of occupying the position they occupied in the world they were in. The informal economy of the office was also the economy in which friendship and solidarity were possible. The same structure that created the conditions of vulnerability also created the conditions for the mutual support that made survival possible. The women who worked in the same offices, who understood the same informal landscape, who navigated the same unofficial requirements, built their relationships in the space opened by that shared knowledge. They were colleagues in both the formal and the informal sense, co-navigators of the same difficult terrain, and the quality of their understanding of each other was shaped by the specificity of what they shared. Let the office dim now. Let the informal economy's ledger close for the night. The debits and credits of the day are settled. The air is cool. Rest. There is a particular kind of quiet that lives inside old-school buildings late in the afternoon, the kind that settles after the last student has gathered her things and walked out into the grey city air, when the desks sit empty, and the chalk dust drifts and the sound of typing still seems to echo faintly in the walls, a memory the room has not yet released. In cities across America, through the 1940s and 1950s and into the 60s, there were hundreds of these schools. They went by respectable names: the Catherine Gibbs School, the Gregg School, the Wood Secretarial College. Some occupied entire floors of downtown office buildings. Some were housed in converted homes on side streets, with modest signs by the front door and a smell of floor wax and carbon paper that greeted you as you stepped inside. Young women came to these schools from all kinds of places, from small towns in Ohio and Georgia and upstate New York, where their mothers had graduated from high school and their fathers worked in factories or on farms, and the understood agreement was this: a girl could better herself by learning to type. She could find steady work in an office. She could become respectable and useful, and perhaps, if she was lucky, she could find herself near men of education and ambition who might notice her one day in a different way entirely. The curriculum was thorough and demanding, and it did not trouble itself with ambiguity. Shorthand notation, touch typing on manual typewriters, business correspondence, filing systems, basic bookkeeping, office protocols, and woven through all of it, in ways both explicit and unspoken, a careful education in how a woman was to conduct herself in the presence of the men who would employ her. The Catherine Gibbs School was perhaps the most celebrated. Its alumni were sometimes called Gibbs Girls, and the name carried a particular cachet in the world of corporate offices. Gibbs graduates were known for their precision, their poise, their reliable discretion. Employers sought them out. The school had a waiting list. And what the Catherine Gibbs School taught, it taught completely. There were classes in what to wear, conservative suits, low heels, nothing that might draw attention to the body. There were lessons in how to speak, clearly, pleasantly, never too loudly. How to answer the telephone in a voice that conveyed competence without assertiveness. How to greet visitors to the office with warmth, but not with the kind of warmth that might be mistaken for something else. There were instructions about demeanour. A good secretary was steady, unflappable. She did not bring her personal troubles into the office. She did not cry, or if she cried, she did so privately, and only after returning to the powder room and composing herself in the mirror before stepping back out again. She did not express opinions about company decisions that were not hers to make. She did not quarrel. She did not complain. She was, in other words, trained to be invisible in all the ways that counted and present in all the ways that served. The typing rooms had a particular atmosphere. Rows of young women sat before their machines, their backs straight, their fingers positioned on the home keys, the sound of their work filling the room like a mechanical rainfall. A clatter and ring and clatter again that was oddly rhythmic, almost soothing if you let it wash over you. Instructors walked slowly between the rows, watching for dropped wrists and hesitating fingers and the telltale pause of a student searching for a letter. Speed mattered. Accuracy mattered. In the professional world these women were being prepared for, a secretary who could type 80 words per minute was more valuable than one who could type 60. Errors required retyping entire pages on manual machines, or the laborious correction of mistakes using white correction fluid that smelled sharply chemical and dried in a way that always showed a slight ridge on the paper that a sharp-eyed supervisor might notice. The shorthand rooms had a different quality, quieter, more interior. Shorthand notation was a form of code, a system of loops and angles and curves that represented sounds and syllables in abbreviated form. Learning it required a kind of patient, repetitive practice that was almost meditative. Students filled notebooks with these symbols, transcribing dictation played from recordings, learning to move their pencils fast enough to capture speech as it unfolded. A secretary who could take dictation was irreplaceable. She sat across from her employer while he spoke, her notebook open on her knee, her pencil moving in those small precise symbols, capturing his words as he paced, or sat, or drummed his fingers on the desk. She would then return to her own station and transcribe what she had recorded, producing a clean-typed document that transformed his thoughts into correspondence ready to send. This intimacy, the physical proximity of taking dictation, the sitting close enough to hear the texture of a man's voice, to notice when he was nervous or confident or distracted, was simply part of the job. It was not spoken of as intimate, it was spoken of as professional, but intimacy is intimacy regardless of what name it is given, and young women learned quickly that the relationship between a secretary and her boss occupied a strange space, close and yet bounded, personal and yet transactional. Some of the schools taught more than typing and shorthand. There were courses on office management, on how to anticipate what a supervisor needed before he asked for it, on how to protect his time from interruptions and callers who did not merit his attention. There were lessons in memory. A good secretary knew her employer's preferences, his appointments, his children's names, his wife's birthday, his coffee order. She was a kind of external memory, a living record of his professional life. And threaded through all of these lessons was a message that was never stated directly, but was perfectly clear to every woman who received it. You are here to make someone else's work possible. Your own ambitions, if you have them, are secondary. The goal is not to advance, but to enable. You are the mechanism by which important things get done, not the person for whom important things are done. The schools did not teach this cruelly. They taught it as practical wisdom, as the reality of the world into which their students were being sent, and in many ways it was the reality. The offices of American corporations in the 1950s and early 60s were not places where women were climbing toward leadership. They were places where women performed essential labour that kept the whole structure running, and were thanked for it with modest salaries and the understanding that they knew their place. Some women flourished in this world regardless. They found genuine satisfaction in the precision and the competence and the quiet power of being the person who actually knew where everything was and how everything worked. They built real careers, earned real loyalty, developed real influence within the particular geography of their offices. They were not nothing. They were essential. But essential is not the same as protected. What the schools did not teach, could not teach, had no language for teaching, was what to do when the man across the desk said something that made the air go wrong. When a hand lingered too long on a shoulder. When an invitation arrived that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but occupied some uncomfortable space between the two. When the atmosphere of the office shifted in ways that were hard to name and harder to address. For that, there was no curriculum. For that, the young women who had learned to type and file and take dictation and compose perfect business letters were entirely on their own. The schools gave their students skills. The schools gave their students poise. The schools gave their students a certain kind of competence in the world of offices. What the schools could not give them was a word for what sometimes happened in those offices. That word would not arrive for another 20 years, and in the meantime the women carried on, straight-backed and steady, their notebooks open on their knees, their pencils moving. Before you can describe something, you must have words for it, and before you have words for it, the experience exists in a kind of fog, real, present, affecting everything around it, but shapeless and therefore difficult to hold, difficult to point at, difficult to bring before anyone who might help. This is where women found themselves through most of the 1950s and 60s and into the early 1970s. Something was happening in offices across America, something that had been happening for as long as offices had existed. And yet there was no single name for it, no category into which it could be placed, no legal framework within which a complaint could be lodged. Women spoke of it in fragments. They spoke to each other in the way people speak about things that carry shame, quietly, obliquely, with carefully constructed distance. A friend might say that her boss was difficult. Another might say that the atmosphere at her office was uncomfortable. A woman might describe a specific incident in terms that minimized it even as she described it, because minimizing was a form of protection. If you described it as too serious, you risked being disbelieved. You risked being told you had misunderstood. You risked being asked what you had done to invite it. So the language was small, it was hedged, it was careful. My boss made a comment. My supervisor said something that bothered me. There is a man at the office who makes things difficult. The phrasing never quite captured the weight of what it was pointing at, because the phrasing available was never designed for that purpose. Consider what women actually experienced. A supervisor who called his secretary sweetheart and made comments about her figure in front of other employees. A colleague who stood too close and touched too often, and whose behaviour made the simple act of arriving at work each morning feel like bracing for something. A boss who made clear, in ways that were never written down and never spoken in full sentences, that her continued employment was connected to her willingness to please him in ways that had nothing to do with her ability to type. These were not small inconveniences. They were conditions that shaped every hour of the working day. They affected concentration, sleep, the experience of Sunday evenings knowing Monday was coming. They affected physical health, the tension that lives in shoulders and jaw when a person is always slightly on guard, always monitoring the atmosphere, always calculating whether this particular moment is safe or not. But there was no single word for this condition. Without a word, it was very difficult to explain to anyone in authority what was wrong, because authority wanted specifics. Authority wanted to be able to look at a rule and see whether it had been broken, and no rule had been written that covered what these women were describing, because the people who wrote rules had not imagined it as something that required a rule. When women did try to complain, and many did at great personal cost, they encountered a vocabulary that worked against them. The available language framed what happened not as a workplace problem, but as a personal one. A misunderstanding, a social awkwardness, an unfortunate incident that perhaps reflected poorly on how the woman had presented herself. If a woman said that her boss made her uncomfortable, she might be asked whether she had perhaps been too friendly, whether her clothing had given the wrong impression, whether she was sure she had not misread a harmless remark. The implicit suggestion was always the same, that the experience she was describing was at least partly her own fault, or at least partly her own misinterpretation, and therefore not something the company needed to address. This was not accidental. The language available, the misunderstanding, the unfortunate incident, the sensitive employee, served a function. It redirected the problem away from the institution and toward the individual. It kept the discomfort private rather than allowing it to become structural. It protected the men and the companies and the arrangements that benefited everyone except the women at the centre of them. There were women who fought through this fog and tried to find language adequate to what they were experiencing. Letters survive from this era, written by women to personnel departments and company supervisors, attempting to describe in formal language what was being done to them. These letters are striking documents. They are carefully worded, they are precise. They make every effort to present the situation in terms that an employer would have to take seriously. And they were, almost universally, ignored or turned back against the women who wrote them. A woman at a government agency who wrote a letter to her personnel office describing her supervisor's behaviour received a response that noted her work had been evaluated as satisfactory and that no further action was necessary. The letter she'd written described incidents that would today be immediately recognisable as harassment. In the vocabulary available at the time, they were simply unpleasant workplace dynamics that the company preferred not to address. Another woman, working for a large corporation, described in a letter to a senior manager that her direct supervisor was making her employment conditional on spending time with him outside of work. She used careful, measured language. She did not accuse, she described. She requested guidance on how to proceed. The response she received suggested she had perhaps misunderstood her supervisor's intentions and recommended she speak with him directly to clear up any confusion. Speak with him directly. The man whose behaviour she was reporting, as though the problem were a miscommunication rather than an abuse of power. This was the wall that women encountered when they tried to complain. Not always hostility, though there was sometimes hostility. More often something softer and in some ways more devastating. The gentle, firm, reasonable-sounding insistence that the problem did not quite exist in the way the woman described it, that it was something smaller, that it could be handled quietly between the people involved, that bringing it forward formally was an overreaction. The absence of language was itself a kind of power. The people who controlled workplaces did not need to explicitly prohibit women from complaining. They simply needed to maintain a world in which the thing women were complaining about had no name, no legal category, no established path by which a complaint could travel and arrive somewhere that might actually respond. In that world, women's experiences could be acknowledged sympathetically in private and dismissed entirely in institutional terms. Yes, that sounds difficult, but there is nothing here for us to act upon. There is no policy that covers this situation. There is no framework for what you are describing. What was needed was not only a word. What was needed was a word that could carry legal weight, a word that could turn a private experience into a public wrong, a word that could take what happened in offices across America and name it as something that the law should concern itself with. That word was coming, but it had not arrived yet, and in its absence, women went on trying to find adequate language for something that kept happening in the silence between the words they had. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, and tucked within it was a provision called Title VII. Title VII prohibited employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of race, colour, religion, national origin, or sex. The inclusion of sex in that list was somewhat accidental, added at the last moment by a congressman who was reportedly opposed to the bill and thought the addition would make it too absurd to pass. He was wrong about that. The bill passed, and sex discrimination in employment was, at least on paper, illegal. To enforce Title VII, Congress created an agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as the EEOC. Women who faced discrimination in the workplace could file a complaint with the EEOC, which would then investigate and, if the complaint had merit, attempt to bring about a remedy. This was, in theory, a significant development. For the first time, there was an institutional mechanism through which a woman could bring a complaint about her treatment in the workplace and expect someone in authority to consider it seriously. In practice, the EEOC in its early years was an agency that did not quite know what to do with itself, and particularly did not quite know what to do with the complaints about sex discrimination that arrived at its door. The agency was understaffed, underfunded, and led by officials who had come to civil rights enforcement primarily through the lens of race. Sex discrimination felt to many of those officials like a different and somehow lesser category of concern. The first chairman of the EEOC described the provision banning sex discrimination as a fluke conceived out of wedlock, which tells you something about the seriousness with which the agency's leadership initially regarded it. Women filed complaints anyway. They filed complaints about being paid less than men doing identical work. They filed complaints about being passed over for promotions in favour of less qualified male colleagues. They filed complaints about being required to resign when they became pregnant. They filed complaints about employers who refused to hire women for certain categories of jobs on the grounds that such positions were not suitable for women. The EEOC processed these complaints slowly, inconsistently, and with mixed results. Some women got hearings. Some hearings led to action. Many did not. The agency developed a substantial backlog of cases, and women who filed complaints sometimes waited years for any response at all. But there was something that the EEOC could not process at all in its early years. Something that women were increasingly trying to describe when they came forward. Not the failure to be promoted, not the unequal pay, but the experience of the workplace environment itself. The comments, the touching, the atmosphere of threat and condescension that made simply being present in certain offices a daily ordeal. The EEOC had no category for this. Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination was understood primarily in terms of concrete employment actions: the hire, the fire, the promotion, the pay. What women described when they tried to report the atmosphere of their offices did not fit neatly into this framework. Nothing had been taken from them in a formal sense. They had not been fired, or not yet. They had simply been made to feel, every day, that their presence in the workplace was conditional and their safety was not guaranteed. When women approached the EEOC with these complaints in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were often told, gently or less gently, that the agency did not have jurisdiction over what they were describing, that what they were experiencing, while regrettable, was not a legal matter, that Title VII did not cover the texture of office life, only the formal terms of employment. There was a woman in Washington in those years who worked for a federal agency. She was competent and well regarded, and her performance evaluations were consistently positive. And then something shifted. Her supervisor began behaving toward her in ways she found impossible to ignore. Comments about her appearance, suggestions that carried meanings she was not comfortable with, an atmosphere around her that had changed quality, that felt watched and pressured in ways she could not quite formalize. She tried to address it directly. She tried to speak to her supervisor about it. He was dismissive. She filed a complaint with her agency's personnel office. They found insufficient basis for action. She filed a complaint with the EEOC. The EEOC considered her case and concluded that what she described, while unpleasant, did not constitute a violation of Title VII as the agency then understood it. Eventually she was transferred. Then her position was eliminated. She brought a lawsuit. The case worked its way through the courts over several years and eventually helped establish that what she had experienced was indeed sex discrimination under Title VII. But at the time she filed her initial complaint, none of that had yet been decided. She was simply a woman trying to describe something that had happened to her in an office, to an institution that had been created specifically to hear complaints about employment discrimination, and being told that what she described was not quite discrimination, in any sense the law recognized. This pattern repeated itself across the country through the late 1960s and into the 70s. Women brought their experiences to the institution that existed to receive them and were turned away. Not always with cruelty, not always with dismissal, but with the institutional language of insufficient basis for action, of matters outside our jurisdiction, of recommending that the employee seek resolution through other channels. The other channels were not there. That was precisely the problem. There was a broader failure of imagination at work, and it was a failure that ran through all the institutions that might have helped. Courts, regulatory agencies, employers, union officials, all of them operated within a set of assumptions about what workplace problems looked like that had been developed without taking seriously what women actually experienced in workplaces. The assumption was that discrimination was something that happened in discrete moments. You did not get the job, you did not get the raise, you were asked to leave. These were events that could be identified, investigated, remedied. But the daily erosion of a woman's working life by the behaviour of men who knew they could behave that way, this was something different. It was less an event than a condition. And the law had not yet developed the tools to recognise a condition as a harm. It would take legal scholars and activists and litigants working through the 1970s to build those tools, to argue carefully and persistently that conditions could be violations, that an environment could be discriminatory even if no single act within it rose to the level of a formal employment action, that a woman forced to work in an atmosphere that was hostile and threatening had suffered sex discrimination just as surely as a woman who had been denied a promotion for being female. The groundwork for that argument was being laid slowly and often invisibly, while the EEOC sorted its backlog and women kept filing complaints that the agency was not yet equipped to fully hear. Somewhere in those filing cabinets, in those cases processed and closed without remedy, in those complaints marked insufficient basis for action, were the seeds of a legal revolution. They were just seeds, not yet visible, not yet powerful, but they were there, waiting for the water and light that would eventually come in the form of lawyers who understood what the law could be made to mean, and scholars who could build the arguments those lawyers needed, and women who were willing, despite everything, to keep going forward. Washington in the 1960s had a particular quality in the mornings. The city woke early. Taxis moved through streets still damp from the night. The great federal buildings stood pale in the early light, their columns casting long shadows across the pavements, and inside them, in offices on the second and third and fourth floors, the day was already beginning. She arrived before 8, as she always did. Her heels made a particular sound on the marble floors of the lobby, and she noticed that sound without thinking about it, the way you notice things that have become part of your daily rhythm. She nodded to the guard at the security desk. She pressed the button for the elevator. She rode up to the third floor. Her desk was near the window. She liked the window, liked the way the light came in during the morning and moved across the floor as the day went on. There was something grounding about that, something that made the hours feel less static. She arranged her things as she always did, the notebook to the left, the inbox to the right, the small calendar that she kept meticulously updated with her supervisor's schedule and her own. Her name was not Diane Williams, though her story was not so different from Diane Williams's. She worked for a federal agency in a capacity that required skill and precision and the kind of institutional memory that takes years to build. She knew where the files were. She knew which senator's office required a particular kind of deference in correspondence. She knew the rhythms of the agency and the people within it, and the way things worked, and the way they sometimes didn't. She was good at her job, this was not in dispute. Her supervisor was a man who had come up through the agency over many years and who understood his own position clearly. He was confident in the way that certain men in certain positions in the 1960s were confident, with the easy assurance of someone who had never had reason to question whether he belonged where he was. He arrived each morning after 9. He took her coffee order and then forgot it. He called her by her first name and sometimes by a diminutive of her first name that she had not invited. In the early months, the job was what she had expected. There was work, and she did the work, and she was good at it, and there was a kind of satisfaction in that. Federal employment had seemed, when she'd accepted the position, like a relatively stable and professional environment. Government agencies had rules, there were personnel manuals, there were processes. What she had not fully understood, when she had accepted the position, was that rules and processes are only as meaningful as the people who enforce them. And in her particular office, in her particular agency, the people who might have enforced the rules were the same people who had no interest in enforcing them. It began small, the way it often did. A comment here, a joke there, the kind of joke that was not funny and not quite a joke, that occupied some uncertain space between the two. She noticed it and filed it away and told herself it was nothing, because that is what you tell yourself when you're trying very hard to keep a job you work to get. Then it grew. It grew in the way that things grow when they meet no resistance, not dramatically, not in sudden eruptions, but steadily and gradually, like a vine finding its way into the mortar of a wall. A comment about how she looked on a particular morning, a question about whether she had plans for the evening, asked in a tone that was not quite professional. A moment when she was reaching for a file and his hand was suddenly there, not quite touching, but present in a way that made her stomach tighten. She began to dread the mornings. This is something that people who have not experienced it do not always understand. Not the dramatic incidents, which were terrible in their own way, but the dread, the Sunday evening feeling, the lying awake with tomorrow already a weight on the chest, the calculating before you got up what the day might hold and how to navigate it. She spoke to a colleague once, obliquely, the way women spoke to each other about these things. Her colleague listened carefully and said something sympathetic and then said, "Well, at least he hasn't actually done anything." As though the thing he had done, the atmosphere he had created, the way he had made her feel every day about coming into her own office, was not something. As though it were a lesser category of problem, not quite real, not quite significant. She tried to address it directly. She chose a moment when he was in a good mood and she raised the comments carefully, framing them as a misunderstanding she wanted to clear up. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read and told her she was too sensitive. She returned to her desk with the feeling that she had managed the conversation badly, though she could not identify exactly what she should have done differently. The agency had a personnel office. She made an appointment. She sat across from a woman behind a desk and described what had been happening as precisely and calmly as she could. The woman listened carefully. She made notes. At the end of the conversation, she said that this sounded like a difficult situation and that she would look into it. She also said that in her experience, these things often work themselves out when given time. They did not work themselves out. What happened next was quieter and more comprehensive than any single act. Her supervisor began assigning her less interesting work. The projects she had been involved in, the ones that required judgment and skill, were given to others. She began to notice that she was less included in meetings. Her contributions were acknowledged less. The office was telling her something, in the way that offices communicate when they have decided something. You are no longer entirely welcome here. She lasted another year. Then she left. Not fired, technically, but departed under circumstances that made it clear staying was no longer tenable. She found another position elsewhere and did not speak about what had happened at the agency for a long time, because there was no language for what had happened, no framework that would have made it make sense to anyone she might have told. Her story did not become a landmark case. It did not appear in law journals or get cited in Supreme Court briefs. It is not remembered except perhaps by her and by the handful of people who were there. But it was not a rare story. It was, in its essential shape, the story of many thousands of women working in offices across Washington and across the country through those years. The marble floor of the lobby, the elevator, the desk near the window, the calendar updated with someone else's appointments, and each morning the calculation of what the day might bring and how to survive it without losing the thing she had worked to build. That was the texture of it. Not spectacular, not cinematic, just daily and grinding and without remedy. The law tends to think in terms of events. A thing happened or did not happen. A rule was violated or was not violated. An action was taken or was not taken. This is part of how law achieves the clarity it needs to function, by identifying discrete moments, particular acts, specific decisions that can be examined and judged. But human experience does not always organize itself into discrete events. Some of the most significant things that happen to people happen not in single moments, but in accumulated ones. The overall weight of 1,000 small things is sometimes greater than any single large thing would be, and for much of the 20th century the law was not equipped to recognize this. This was the central problem in the legal struggle over what we now call a hostile work environment. The behaviour that made offices unlivable for so many women was often not concentrated in single acts. It was spread across time, distributed through daily interactions, presenting comments and gestures and looks and implications that individually might seem minor but collectively created something that was genuinely harmful. The legal scholars and activists who spent the 1970s trying to build a framework for this were working against several kinds of resistance at once. There was the resistance of employers, who preferred to treat any given incident as isolated and minor, and who strenuously objected to any legal theory that would hold them responsible for the cumulative effect of their employees' behaviour. There was the resistance of courts, which were accustomed to thinking about discrimination in terms of concrete employment actions, the hire, the fire, the promotion, and which were sceptical of theories that seemed to extend legal liability into the less tangible realm of workplace atmosphere. There was the resistance of the culture at large, which still tended to view the kind of behaviour women were describing as normal, as simply the way offices worked, as something women needed to manage rather than something that required legal remedy. Catherine McKinnon, a young legal scholar who would publish a groundbreaking book on the subject in 1979, articulated the theory more clearly than anyone had before. Sexual harassment at work, she argued, was not a personal problem between individuals. It was a structural phenomenon, something that flowed from the organisation of power in workplaces, from the fact that women occupied subordinate positions and men occupied positions of authority, and from the way that dynamic enabled certain kinds of behaviour. McKinnon distinguished between two forms. The first was what she called quid pro quo harassment, the explicit or implicit offer of employment benefits in exchange for sexual compliance. This was relatively easier for the law to recognise, because it had the shape of a transaction, a concrete bargain in which something was offered and something was demanded. The second was what she called condition of work harassment, what would later be called the hostile environment. This was harder to formalise because it was not organised around a single transaction, but around an ongoing state, an environment in which the comments, the touching, the jokes, the looks, the general atmosphere of sexual pressure and condescension made a woman's working life a constant ordeal. McKinnon's argument was that both of these constituted sex discrimination under Title VII, not because they were versions of the same individual wrong, but because they were both expressions of the same structural inequality, the use of sexuality as a mechanism of power over women in workplaces. This was a significant argument. It reframed what had previously been understood as a private and interpersonal problem into something structural and therefore legal. It suggested that the law's existing tools, the prohibition on sex discrimination in employment, could be extended to cover not just formal employment actions but the conditions under which work was performed. The argument did not immediately prevail. Courts were cautious. Some rejected it entirely, holding that what women described as harassment was simply an unfortunate personal matter that Title VII was not designed to address. Others accepted pieces of it while rejecting others. The law developed unevenly, different circuits reaching different conclusions, a patchwork of precedent that left women in different parts of the country with different levels of protection. But the argument was being made and being refined, and slowly, case by case, it was gaining ground. Central to the development of hostile environment theory was the idea that the environment itself could constitute discrimination, not just the acts within it, but the overall conditions it created. A woman who was required to work in a place where she was subject to ongoing sexual comments and behaviours was being discriminated against in her terms and conditions of employment, not just on the day a specific comment was made, but every day she worked in that environment. This was a powerful insight because it matched what women actually experienced. The harm of a hostile environment was not primarily located in any single incident. It was located in the ongoing state of things, the background radiation of threat and discomfort that shaped every interaction, every hour of every workday. It affected concentration, it affected performance, it affected health, in the ways that chronic stress affects health, the tension, the sleeplessness, the hypervigilance that never quite turns off. Women working in hostile environments spent enormous amounts of energy managing the environment rather than doing their work, energy that, in a fair world, would have been available for the job they were actually there to do. This was the harm, not dramatic and sudden, like a blow, but steady and grinding like water against stone. Over time it wore things away, ambition, confidence, the simple pleasure of working well at something you were capable of doing. The legal framework being built in the 1970s tried to capture this. It tried to create language precise enough to bring these harms before courts, in a form that courts could recognize and respond to. It was meticulous, painstaking work, conducted largely by women who had experienced what they were trying to describe, who understood from the inside what the architecture of a hostile environment actually felt like. The culmination of that work in legal terms came in 1986 with the Supreme Court's decision in Merita Savings Bank versus Vinson. But the foundation was laid in these earlier years, in the arguments made by McKinnon and the cases brought by women like Diane Williams and Paulette Barnes and Michelle Vinson herself. The architecture of the hostile environment was not built in a day. It was built by accumulation, the same way the harms it described were created by accumulation, and in understanding that, the law was finally beginning to catch up to reality. The Supreme Court's decision in Merita Savings Bank versus Vinson, handed down in June of 1986, was unanimous. 9 justices, across ideological lines that were already visible in that era, agreed on the fundamental holding that sexual harassment could constitute sex discrimination under Title VII, and that a hostile or abusive work environment was a form of that discrimination recognizable under federal law. It was by any measure a significant decision. The legal theory that had been built over a decade, through the work of Catherine McKinnon, through the cases brought by Diane Williams and others who followed her, through the gradual shifting of judicial opinion, had finally been ratified by the highest court in the country. The term coined at Cornell in 1975 had travelled from a consciousness-raising group to the Supreme Court in 11 years. The day after the decision, things in American workplaces did not immediately change. This is important to understand. Law creates categories and establishes rights, but it does not, by itself, change behaviour. The existence of a legal remedy does not automatically produce the conditions under which people feel safe enough to use it. And in the years following Meritor, the distance between what the law now said and what actually happened in offices across the country remained very significant. There were immediate practical problems. To bring a sexual harassment claim under the framework established by Meritor, a woman needed evidence, documentation of incidents, witnesses willing to speak, a record of complaints she had made and responses she had received. In an era before email, when interactions were often verbal and unrecorded, this evidence was frequently impossible to assemble in a form courts found adequate. There was also the problem of access. The legal process was expensive. Finding an attorney willing to take a harassment case required resources and connections that many women did not have. Class action mechanisms were limited. The practical barriers to litigation were substantial, particularly for women in lower wage positions who could least afford the cost of fighting. And there was the problem of retaliation. Even with the law now clearly on their side in principle, women who brought complaints faced the real possibility that doing so would end their careers. In the immediate aftermath of Meritor, there was no robust legal protection against retaliation that would have deterred employers from making things very difficult for women who complained. The calculation remained for many women that the cost of complaining was too high. Corporations began, slowly, to develop policies. Human resources departments that had not previously concerned themselves much with sexual harassment began creating manuals and procedures and training programs. The compliance machinery of corporate America turned its attention to the issue because there was now legal liability to manage. But there is a difference between a policy and a culture. The policies that companies developed in the years after Meritor were frequently designed less to protect women than to protect companies, to create a record showing that the company had done something, so that if a lawsuit arose, the company could point to its procedures and argue it had taken reasonable steps. The machinery of compliance and the reality of protection were not always the same thing. Women who brought complaints through newly created internal processes often found that those processes moved slowly, required them to confront the people they were complaining about, and frequently resulted in findings that were inconclusive or in outcomes that required them to continue working alongside the people who had harmed them. The cultural change was slower and more uneven than the legal change. In some workplaces, the combination of legal liability and genuine leadership attention produced real improvements. The kinds of behaviour that had been normalised through the 1960s and 70s became less tolerated, less invisible, less protected by the shared assumption that this was simply how offices worked. In other workplaces, the change was more superficial. The behaviours continued, or transformed into forms that were harder to document and more deniable. The office climate improved in official policy documents while remaining hostile in daily experience. Women learned that the protections the law offered in theory were often harder to access in practice than the law's advocates had hoped. This gap between the law on paper and the experience in the room remained the defining feature of the years following Merita. Progress was real. The legal framework that had been built gave women tools they had not had before, and those tools made a difference. Cases were brought and won. Some employers changed genuinely. Some workplaces became measurably better. But the problem had not been solved. The conditions that had created the problem in the first place, the concentration of power in the hands of men, the economic vulnerability of women in employment settings, the cultural tolerance for the treatment of women as sexual objects rather than professional colleagues. These conditions did not disappear because the Supreme Court handed down a ruling. The women who had fought to create the legal framework understood this. Catherine McKinnon, in interviews after Merita, was clear that the decision was a beginning rather than an ending. Lynn Farley, who had coined the term 11 years earlier and had spent a decade watching what the naming of the problem could and could not accomplish, understood that a word and a legal framework were necessary but not sufficient. What was also needed was something harder to legislate, a change in how power was distributed in workplaces, in how women's authority and expertise were regarded, in what kinds of behaviour were considered normal and acceptable, in the fundamental assumptions about what workplaces were for and who they were designed to serve. Some of that change came over the following decades, not uniformly, not completely, not without enormous ongoing effort from the women who continued to bring cases and write arguments and organise and insist, but it came. The 1980s and 90s saw a gradual shift in what was considered professionally acceptable. Behaviours that had been utterly routine in offices of the 1960s, the comments, the touching, the jokes, the condescension, became, in many environments, grounds for complaint and consequence. The vocabulary that had not existed in 1965 had, by 1995, become part of the standard language of workplace policy across the country. This was not a small thing. To give something a name is to make it visible. To make it visible is to make it possible to address. The journey from no name to legal protection to cultural change was long and incomplete, and continues still. But it began, as so many important things begin, with a small group of people deciding to call something what it was. In 1975, in a building on the Cornell campus, a group of women sat around a table and found a word for something that millions of women had experienced without being able to name. That act was quiet. It was modest. It was the beginning of everything that followed. There are letters that were never written. There are words that formed in the mind and dissolved before reaching paper. There are complaints that were composed in careful detail during sleepless hours and then set aside in the morning when the day began again and the calculation was made one more time that the risk was too great. In the years before 1975, before the word existed, before the legal framework took shape, the interior lives of women in offices went largely unrecorded. What they thought, what they felt, what they would have said if saying it had been possible. These things lived in the space between what was spoken and what was not. History preserves what is spoken. The rest disappears. But we can imagine it. History sometimes requires this. Not to invent what we do not know, but to hold open a space for the experiences that the record did not have the tools to capture. To sit for a moment with what it was actually like. A woman sits at her desk in the late afternoon. The office is quiet at this hour. Most of her colleagues have gone, and the building has settled into the particular silence of almost empty places, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of a cleaning cart in the hallway. Her work is finished. She should go home. She does not quite move to leave. She is thinking about something that happened this morning. It was not a large thing, or not large in the vocabulary available to her. Her supervisor said something, and there was something in the way he said it that she understood but could not explain. a quality beneath the words, an implication that was clear to her and would be clear to anyone who knew him, but that she could not point at without him being able to say she had imagined it. She has been at this job for 3 years. She is good at it. Her supervisor's supervisor has told her so, in formal reviews and informally. She knows the work. She is reliable. She has built something here, not a career in the sense that the word was typically applied to women in that era, but something real nonetheless. A position. A knowledge of how this particular office worked and how to navigate it, and who needed what and when. She does not want to lose it. And so she sits at her desk in the quiet late afternoon and she composes in her head the letter she will not send. She addresses it to the personnel office. She begins with the date and her position and her supervisor's name. She describes, in careful, specific language, what has been happening over the past several months. Not dramatically, not with accusation. She describes incidents and dates and words spoken as precisely as she can recall them. In her mind, the letter is clear and calm and persuasive. It presents facts. It does not editorialize. It trusts the facts to speak for themselves, because she believes, or wants to believe, that facts presented to reasonable people will produce a reasonable response. She sits with this imaginary letter for a while. Then she begins to think about what would happen if she sent it. The personnel office would receive it. Someone would read it. There would be an inquiry. Her supervisor would be questioned. He would say, and she knows what he would say, has heard him say it about other situations in other contexts, that she was sensitive, that she had misunderstood, that the atmosphere of the office was perfectly professional, that he had always treated her with respect. He would say it with the complete confidence of a man who had never had reason to doubt that his account of events would be the one that was believed. And her account? It was her word against his, and in any contest between a supervisor's word and a secretary's word, in any office, in any personnel department, in any era before the legal framework existed to provide another basis for judgment, his word would carry more weight, not because anyone was consciously deciding to prefer him, simply because the structures were built in a way that made his word more legible to the people who would evaluate it. She thinks about her colleagues. Would any of them speak? She has spoken to 2 of them, carefully, obliquely, the way you do. One had been sympathetic and then suggested she try not to take it personally. The other had said, almost gently, that she should be careful, that drawing attention to herself in this way was risky, that she should think about what she really wanted from this situation. What she really wanted was to come to work without it being like this. That was what she really wanted, but that was not among the options that seemed available. She thinks about her rent, about her family back in the town she left for this city, about the particular kind of failure it would be to return without having made the thing work. She's not failed at anything yet. She's not ready to fail now. She thinks about another woman who worked here 2 years ago and who left under circumstances that were never fully explained but that everyone in the office understood. That woman had filed a complaint, not with the personnel office. She had gone further, to some external body. The details were never entirely clear. And she had left, or been made to leave, and now worked somewhere else, and the people who remained spoke about it only carefully and only in private, with expressions that could mean sympathy or warning or both at once. The woman at the desk slowly releases the imaginary letter. She lets it go the way you release a breath you have been holding too long. She gathers her things, she puts on her coat. She straightens her desk in the way that has become habitual, a small act of order that gives her a moment of control over something. She walks out of the office and down the corridor and into the elevator and out through the lobby and into the street, where the evening air is cool and the city is loud with commuters heading home. She goes home, she eats dinner, she sleeps or does not sleep. In the morning she will return. This is the story that has no archive, no case file, no precedent, no citation in any brief. It is the story of the choice not to act, made by women who understood clearly what the cost of acting would be. It is the story of all the letters composed in the mind and released unwritten, of all the words that existed as thought and not as text, of all the harm that was never described because the act of describing it was itself too costly. The law, when it finally arrived, gave women a new set of options. It did not erase the memory of the years when there were no options. Somewhere in the filing systems of history, in the space where records were never made, those years remain. The letters never sent, the words never spoken, the weight of all that silence. Buildings hold things, not in any mystical sense, but in the ordinary sense that the places where things happen carry the memory of them in the way that all material things carry the memory of their use. The worn path across a courtyard, the groove in a threshold stone, the way a door settles in its frame after years of being opened in the same way by the same hands. Things leave marks. The offices of mid-century America were not elegant places mostly. There was fluorescent lighting and linoleum, and the particular grey-beige of walls that had been painted the same institutional colour so many times that the colour had become a kind of policy. There were metal desks and rolling chairs and filing cabinets in rows, and the smell of carbon paper and correction fluid, and the coffee that was always being made somewhere, in a small room off the main floor by whoever's turn it was. In these offices, decade after decade, a certain kind of life was lived. Women arrived in the mornings and hung up their coats and sat at their desks and began the work that kept things moving. The letters typed and filed, the calls received and routed, the schedules maintained and the appointments kept, the 1,000 daily acts of precision and attention that made it possible for the organisation to function. And in these same offices, in the spaces between the official work and the official record, other things happened too. The things we have been talking about through all these chapters. The things that had no name for so long and then finally received one. What did those offices remember? What was held in the walls of those rooms where so much of this occurred? They remembered the sound of a typewriter and the ring of the return carriage. They remembered the smell of the carbon paper and the particular way the light fell in the afternoon, low and amber, through windows that were never quite clean. They remembered the voices of men, confident and easy in their authority, and the voices of women, careful and modulated, performing competence and pleasantness simultaneously. They remembered the pauses, the moment between a comment made and a response calculated, the beat of silence in which a woman decided how to respond to something, how to deflect without provoking, how to maintain the professional surface while managing the thing happening beneath it. These pauses were everywhere in those offices. They accumulated, like the carbon paper dust and the coffee smell, as part of the atmosphere of the place. Time passed, as it does. The typewriters were replaced by word processors, and the word processors by computers, and the carbon paper by email. The institutional grey-beige was repainted, sometimes with more ambitious colours that reflected a newer era's ideas about what workplaces should feel like. New people arrived. The people who had been there through the hard years retired or moved on, or simply aged out of the story in the way that people do. The physical offices changed, the cultural offices changed more slowly. There are women still living who worked in those offices in the 1960s and 70s, women who are now in their 80s and 90s, who remember what it was like before the word existed, and before the law changed, and before the machinery of formal protection, imperfect as it was put in place. Some of them have spoken about it publicly, some have chosen not to. Some carry it as a private knowledge, something that belongs to them alone, part of the texture of a life lived in a particular time and a particular world. When they were young and working in those offices, they were carrying something that most of the people around them could not see. Not because those people were blind, but because the culture had built structures around that blindness, had organised itself to make certain things not quite visible, not quite sayable, not quite the kind of thing you could point at and name. What those women carried was the knowledge of the gap between the official description of their working lives, the respectable position, the professional environment, the career being built, and the actual daily reality. They lived on both sides of that gap simultaneously. They performed the official version while experiencing the actual version, and they did this every day, for years, without much acknowledgement from the world around them that the gap was there at all. This is an extraordinary thing to have done. It required a kind of strength that is not often recognised as strength, because it was exercised in private and without audience. The strength to keep showing up, to keep doing the work, to keep performing competence and pleasantness and professional steadiness in conditions that made all of those things harder than they should have been. The women who brought the lawsuits, who spoke at the consciousness-raising meetings, who wrote the surveys and the articles and the legal briefs, they are part of this history in a visible and recorded way. Their names are in the case reporters and the academic journals and the movement histories. They are acknowledged. But there were many more women who did not bring lawsuits and did not speak at meetings, who simply endured and kept working and managed the gap between the official world and the real one as best they could. They are the larger part of this history, and their names are mostly not recorded. Their experiences did not become precedent. They just lived. And then, slowly, things changed. Not because of any single event or ruling or movement, though all of those helped. Things changed because of the accumulation of everything: the naming, the legal framework, the cultural shift, the gradual adjustment of what was considered normal and acceptable, the slow and incomplete redistribution of whose experience was considered to matter. The offices changed too, not overnight and not completely, but changed. There are offices today where the things that happened in those mid-century rooms would not happen, or would not happen without consequence, or would at least be visible as things that required response rather than things that could be absorbed silently into the ongoing hum of daily work. This is progress. It is real, and it matters. And yet, the gap between official description and daily reality has not closed entirely. The structures that protected certain behaviours for so long do not simply dissolve because the legal framework changes. They transform. They find new forms. The essential dynamic, the use of workplace power to diminish and threaten and control, is older than any office building, and it does not disappear easily. What has changed is the vocabulary, the tools, the possibility at least of being believed. These are not nothing. They are the result of everything we have been talking about. All those years of accumulation, all those women who carried the weight of it, all those moments of quiet courage and furious determination and patient legal argument that added up over time to something. The officers remembered, and eventually, after enough time and enough voices and enough insistence that the thing was real, the world remembered too. Change of the kind we have been talking about, legal, cultural, institutional, does not happen by accident. It happens because people decide to make it happen, and then do the specific, difficult, unglamorous work of making it happen. The work of organising, the work of building coalitions and writing documents and attending meetings and persuading skeptics and refusing to go away when going away would have been easier. In the early 1970s, while the legal arguments were being constructed in law schools and the occasional courageous lawsuit was making its way through the courts, something else was happening simultaneously in workplaces across the country. Women were beginning to find each other, to talk to each other about what was happening in their offices, to recognise, in comparing notes, that what they had each been experiencing privately was not a personal aberration but a widespread and systematic pattern. This recognition was itself transformative. To discover that you are not alone in an experience, that the thing you have been enduring in isolation is being endured by thousands of other women in thousands of other offices, changes your relationship to that experience. It lifts the weight of private shame. It makes it possible to frame the experience as something that requires a public response rather than private management. The consciousness-raising groups of the early women's liberation movement were crucial in this. These were informal gatherings, usually in someone's living room, where women came together to talk about their lives, not in therapeutic terms, not primarily as individual problems to be solved, but as shared experiences that, when laid alongside each other, revealed the contours of a larger structure. Women talked about their marriages, their careers, their experiences of the medical system, their encounters with the education system, the ways they were treated in daily life. And over, in groups across the country, the conversation turned to work, and within work to the particular texture of what happened in offices between women and the men who supervised them. These conversations were not always comfortable. There was shame to work through, the internalized conviction that what had happened was somehow the woman's fault, that she had been too friendly or not friendly enough, too attractive or not professional enough. This shame was a product of the culture, absorbed through years of living in it, and it did not dissolve quickly. But in the presence of other women describing the same experiences, the same shame, the same calculation of whether to say anything and what would happen if they did, in that presence, something loosened. The 9-to-5 organization in Boston was one concrete result of this organizing energy. Founded in 1973 by Karen Nussbaum and a group of women who had been meeting regularly to discuss their working conditions, 9-to-5 began as a consciousness-raising group and evolved into something more structured, a working women's organisation that combined advocacy, education, and direct action. Nussbaum and her colleagues were women who worked in offices and universities and knew from daily experience what those environments were like for women. They were not primarily lawyers or academics. They were secretaries and clerical workers, women who had come to political consciousness through the feminist movement and were applying that consciousness to their immediate circumstances. 9 to 5 published newsletters. They held public meetings. They conducted surveys, asking women to describe their working conditions, their experiences with supervisors, the ways they were treated by the organisations that employed them. The responses they received were overwhelming in their consistency. Women described the same patterns in different cities, different industries, different types of offices. The comments, the touching, the conditional employment, the retaliation when they complained. The names were different, the circumstances were different, the patterns were the same. The Working Women's Institute in New York, founded slightly later, took a more explicitly research-oriented approach. It gathered data on what women were experiencing and worked to translate that data into forms that could be used in legal and policy arguments. Researchers there documented the prevalence of what was happening, the patterns of who experienced it and under what conditions, the effects it had on women's careers and health and economic circumstances. This research mattered. One of the obstacles to taking the problem seriously had always been the implicit suggestion that women were exaggerating, or were unusually sensitive, or were describing isolated incidents as though they were widespread. Data helped push back against this. When surveys showed that the majority of women who were asked about the experience reported having had it, that the numbers were not 10 or 20%, but 50, 60, 70, 80% of working women, the argument that this was rare or exceptional became very difficult to sustain. The 1976 Red Book survey was particularly significant in this regard. Red Book was a mainstream women's magazine, not an academic journal or an advocacy publication. When it surveyed its readers about their experiences of sexual harassment at work, it was speaking to a broad audience of ordinary women, housewives and working women, conservative and progressive, women across the country who subscribed to a general interest magazine about women's lives. The responses came in by the tens of thousands. 9,000 women responded, and the responses painted a picture that no one who examined it honestly could dismiss. Roughly 80 to 90% of respondents reported having experienced some form of sexual harassment at work. The harassment was not confined to any particular industry or region, or type of workplace. It was everywhere. It was ordinary. It was happening, with regularity, to the vast majority of working women who were asked about it. When Red Book published these findings, they reached a readership that had not previously been part of the conversation in feminist organisations and legal scholarship. They reached the women who were experiencing exactly what the survey described, but who had never seen it acknowledged in any public forum, who had never seen the numbers that would have told them they were not alone. The organising work and the research work and the legal work were mutually reinforcing. Each needed the others. The legal arguments needed the research data to show that the problem was real and widespread. The organising needed the legal framework to give women tools and language. The research needed the organising to identify the questions that mattered and to reach the populations of women whose experiences needed to be documented. The women doing this work were operating at the intersection of several worlds that did not always communicate easily with each other. The world of legal scholarship, the world of labour organising, the world of feminist activism, the world of mainstream advocacy and media. They were translating between these worlds, building bridges that allowed the insights from one to reach the others. None of this was paid work, mostly, or it was paid work at the margins, the kind of work that women in underfunded organisations do for modest salaries because they believe in what they are doing. The meetings were in borrowed rooms, the newsletters were typed on borrowed typewriters, the surveys were conducted on weekends and evenings by people who had day jobs. This is how movements work, not in grand gestures but in accumulated small acts of persistence. In the newsletter, mailed to the next city, in the meeting that draws 15 people instead of the hoped-for 50, but that 15 people go home changed. In the woman who reads a survey result and realises that she is not alone in what she has been enduring, and who then tells someone else who tells someone else. The women who organised in the early 1970s were building something whose full shape they could not see from where they stood. They knew they were building something. They were determined and purposeful and not naive about the difficulty of what they were doing. But the Supreme Court decision in 1986 was still more than a decade away. The cultural shift was still further. They were planting seeds in ground that would take years to yield. They planted them anyway. That is what organising is. History has a way of moving faster in the telling than it did in the living. We say 1964 and 1975 and 1986, and we track the arc from one to the next, and the arc seems clear and purposeful, like something that was always going to happen. But the people living inside those years did not know they were inside an arc. They knew only the day they were in, and whether today was better or worse than yesterday, and whether tomorrow looked like something they could manage. For the women who carried the weight of those years, the women who worked in offices that had no language for what was being done to them, who tried to complain and were turned back, who calculated every morning whether to go in and who decided, more often than not, that they had no choice but to go in. For those women the arc was not always visible. What was visible was the accumulation of days. There is a woman, now in her late 80s, who worked for a government agency in Washington through the 1960s. She has spoken occasionally in her later years about what those years were like. She speaks without drama, in the measured way of someone who has had a long time to find the right words for things. She says that she was good at her job. She says that she was proud of her work. She says that there were things that happened that she did not have language for at the time, and that finding the language later, much later, when the word existed and the framework existed and she had the distance of decades, helped her understand what had happened in ways she had not been able to understand while it was happening. She says she does not know whether she would have done anything differently. She had rent to pay. She had a family that depended on her income. She had built something in that job, not career in the traditional sense, but a skill and a knowledge and a position that meant something to her. The calculation of whether to risk all of that was not a simple one, and she does not judge herself for the calculation she made. What she wishes, she says, is that there had been somewhere to go, some mechanism, some process, some institutional acknowledgement that what was happening to her was real and mattered and was not simply a personal problem to be managed privately. What she wishes is that the word had existed sooner, that the law had been there sooner, not because it would have made things easy. She is clear-eyed about the limits of law as a mechanism for cultural change, but because it would have told her that the thing was named and recognised, that she was not simply imagining it or being too sensitive. That recognition would have been something. It would not have been everything, but it would have been something. The history we have told in these chapters is one of incremental progress, one through decades of effort by women who were simultaneously living the problem they were trying to solve. The naming in 1975, the first successful lawsuit in 1976, the legal scholarship of the late 1970s, the cultural moment of 9 to 5 in 1980, the Supreme Court decision in 1986. Each of these was significant. Each was built on what came before and made possible what came after. The progress was real. And yet, the question of what has actually changed, of the distance between the legal framework established by decades of effort and the daily reality of women's working lives, is one that does not have a simple or comfortable answer. The law has changed substantially. The cultural norms have shifted in many environments in ways that would have seemed remarkable to the women typing in those mid-century offices. Things that were once considered unremarkable are now recognised as unacceptable. Things that were once done openly are now done, if at all, with the awareness that there are consequences. This is progress. But the underlying dynamics that made those mid-century offices what they were, the concentration of authority in the hands of men, the economic vulnerability of women who needed their jobs, the cultural tolerance for the use of workplace power as a tool of sexual control, these have not been fully dismantled. They have changed in form. They have become less visible in many contexts, but they persist. The working women's organisations of the 1970s understood this. They were not naive about the limits of legal reform as a tool for achieving structural change. The law could create rights and provide remedies, and establish that certain kinds of behaviour constituted discrimination. What the law could not do was change the economic conditions that made women vulnerable in the first place, or the cultural assumptions that had enabled certain behaviours for so long. or the deeply ingrained habits of mind that shaped how people in workplaces related to each other. Those changes required different tools. They required economic and educational and cultural change, of a kind that moves slowly and unevenly, and is always vulnerable to reversal. They required each generation to do the work again in the conditions it inherited. The women who worked in the offices of the 1960s did not have the benefit of the language that came after them. They did not have the legal framework that subsequent generations have inherited. They worked in conditions that were harder, in some essential ways, than the conditions that came after, because in addition to the behaviour itself, they carried the particular weight of isolation, of having no name for what was happening and no institutional acknowledgement that it was happening. What they had was each other, even if they did not always know it. The conversations in the powder room, the oblique comparisons of experiences over lunch, the quiet solidarity of women who knew, without saying so directly, what the other one was dealing with. This was not nothing. It was not as good as a legal framework and an institutional mechanism and a culture that took the problem seriously, but it was something. It was the beginning of the naming, even before the name arrived. The secretary at her typewriter in 1963, the woman who filed a complaint that went nowhere in 1968, the small group at Cornell who found the word in 1975, the lawyer who built the argument in 1979, the 9 justices who agreed in 1986, the ongoing work of every generation since. These are connected. They are part of a single long story about what it takes to make a wrong visible, to make it nameable, to make it legally recognizable, and then to make the legal recognition actually mean something in the daily lives of people who go to work and deserve to work in conditions where their safety and dignity are not contingent on the forbearance of the powerful. The offices are quiet now, in the late evening. The screens have gone dark. The coffee from this morning has grown cold. Outside the windows, the city continues in its own rhythms, and somewhere in the accumulated memory of those rooms, in the particular quality of the silence that settles after the day has ended and the people have gone home, there is something like the weight of all those years. All those women who came in every morning, all those calculations made in the dark, all those words that were never written down, all that quiet endurance that history does not always know how to recognize, but that was real and mattered and helped make possible everything that came after. That is the story, or as much of it as can be told. The rest lives in the silence between the words, where it has always been. There is a kind of history that does not make it into the textbooks, not the history of laws passed or cases decided or movements that achieved their objectives. The other kind, the history of small dignities fought for and sometimes won in the particular geography of individual lives, the history of what it looked like, on an ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary office, to maintain a sense of yourself in conditions that were not designed with your dignity in mind. This history is harder to tell because it is not organized into events. It does not have a date or a decision or a recognizable turning point. It is the history of choices made in moments that were not witnessed and not recorded. The choice to say something back when something was said. The choice to hold eye contact a beat longer than was comfortable. The choice to do the work so well that the work itself became a kind of answer to everyone who underestimated what you were capable of. The women who worked in offices through the 1950s and 60s and 70s were not simply victims of conditions they could not affect. That framing is too simple and not quite true. They were people navigating an environment, often a hostile one, sometimes a merely indifferent one, with the tools available to them, and they developed tools, strategies, ways of moving through the world of offices that preserved what could be preserved. There was the strategy of excellence. If you were so good at your work that your value to the organization was undeniable, you had a certain protection that women of merely adequate competence did not have. Not absolute protection. A determined supervisor could make your life difficult regardless, but a kind of standing that made it slightly harder to be dismissed entirely. Women who understood this poured themselves into the work. They became indispensable. They made themselves the person in the office who knew everything, who could find anything, who understood the institutional history and the organizational relationships and the unwritten rules better than anyone else. There was the strategy of alliance. The women who fared best in difficult offices were often those who had built careful relationships with the people in the organization, who might, under some circumstances, be helpful. Other women, certainly. The unofficial networks of female solidarity that existed in most offices, the informal exchange of information and support that happened in the ladies' room and at lunch, and in the careful glance that meant I see what is happening over there too, but also sometimes men, the men who were decent, who were bothered by what they saw even if they were not willing to say so directly, who might be counted on to be present in situations where presence mattered. There was the strategy of humour. This was delicate because humour in the wrong register could be taken as invitation or as weakness. But humour in the right register, dry, intelligent, delivered with perfect timing and zero effect, could diffuse a situation, could create a moment of awkwardness for the person who had initiated the problem, could make clear without explicit confrontation that the woman was not going to simply absorb whatever was offered to her. These strategies were not the same as justice. They were adaptations. They were ways of surviving inside conditions that were unjust, and there is a difference between surviving injustice and being free of it. The women who employed these strategies were not free. They were exercising whatever agency was available to them inside a system that constrained their agency in serious ways. But the exercise of agency within constraint is not nothing. It is in fact one of the most distinctly human things there is. The person who finds the space within an unjust system to maintain something of themselves, their dignity, their humour, their sense of their own competence and value, is doing something real, even if it is not the same as dismantling the system. Some women found unexpected satisfactions in those offices. They found colleagues they genuinely liked, work that genuinely challenged them, a sense of efficacy that came from being the person who actually made things run. They built friendships that lasted decades. They learned things about the world of organisations that proved useful later, in ways they could not have predicted when they were young and sitting at their first desk. The experience was not uniformly terrible. It was complicated, the way most human experience is complicated, containing both genuine hardship and genuine pleasure, both the grinding of conditions that should not have been and the small ordinary satisfactions of a day's work done well. What those women could not do, what the conditions of that era made impossible, was bring the full weight of their capabilities to bear on the larger world. The women who became secretaries in the 1950s and 60s were often extraordinarily capable people who, in different circumstances, would have become lawyers and managers and executives and professors. Some of them eventually did, as the world changed, but many did not because the path was too costly or too late or simply not visible from where they stood. This is one of the central losses of that era, not just for the individual women, but for the organisations and institutions and society that did not have access to what those women might have contributed if conditions had been different. The talent that was rerouted into typing pools and filing systems rather than boardrooms and legislative offices and research laboratories. The ideas that were never expressed because the people who held them were not in positions where their ideas were invited. The loss is impossible to quantify. You cannot count what did not happen. You cannot measure the cost of talent diverted from its potential. But you can understand it in the particular, in the individual story of the woman who was the smartest person in the office and everyone knew it, including her boss, who relied on her judgment constantly while paying her a fraction of his salary and giving her no title that reflected what she actually did. Those women are part of this history too, not because they were heroic, though some of them were, not because they suffered, though many did, but because they were there, doing the work, carrying the weight, maintaining their dignity in the spaces where dignity was possible and enduring the loss of it where it was not. They are the texture of the story, the daily presence behind the legal arguments and the organised movements and the landmark decisions, the reason any of it mattered. The offices are empty now, in this imagining. The fluorescent lights have been switched off and the screens are dark and the filing cabinets stand in their rows in the shadows. But in the quiet, if you listen for it, there is something like the memory of the work that was done here. The letters typed and the calls received and the appointments kept and the 1,000 small acts of competence and attention that made it possible for the rest of the organisation to function. And beneath that, quieter, harder to hear, but present, the memory of what it cost, the daily calculation, the weight that was carried and not put down, the dignity that was maintained piece by piece in conditions that made the maintenance of it an act of ongoing effort. That effort deserves to be remembered, not with pity. The women who made it would not want pity, with recognition, with the acknowledgement that they were there, they did the work, they endured what they endured, they fought when they could fight and survived when fighting wasn't possible, and that everything which came after was built on the foundation of what they did and what they bore. The smallest dignities are still dignities. The history of them is still history. And in the quiet of the empty office, that history is present, like a watermark in the paper, not visible unless you hold it up to the light, but there, embedded in the material, part of what the document is made of. Every generation inherits the world it did not make. The working women of the 1980s and 90s inherited an office world that was different, in important ways, from the one their mothers and older sisters had navigated. There were laws now, there were policies, there were words for things and processes through which those words could be made to matter, at least sometimes, at least in theory. This inheritance was uneven, as all inheritances are. Some women entered workplaces that had genuinely changed, where the legal framework had produced real cultural shifts, where behaviour that had once been normalised was now recognised as unacceptable, where the presence of women at senior levels changed the texture of what was considered normal and what was considered out of bounds. Other women entered workplaces that had changed in form but less in substance, where the policies existed in the manual but not in the daily reality, where the training had happened but the culture had not shifted, where a woman who brought a complaint could find herself facing the same disbelief and the same retaliation that her predecessors had faced, only now with a layer of procedural language laid over it. The inheritance was real, but it required ongoing maintenance. Each generation had to do some version of the work again, had to insist in the conditions of their own era that the protections were real and the standards were actual, and the words in the policies meant what they said. The work of making equality real is not completed by a legal ruling or a cultural shift. It requires constant tending, constant insistence, constant willingness to point at the gap between the official version and the actual one. The women who did the work in the 1970s, who named and sued and organised and wrote and argued, did not expect to solve the problem permanently. They were too clear-eyed for that. What they hoped to do was leave the next generation with better tools than they had had. A word, a framework, a precedent, a set of arguments that had been tested and refined and proven in court. They succeeded in that. The tools they left are real and useful and have made a difference. The work that came after, the ongoing litigation, the policy development, the cultural advocacy, the hashtag #MeToo moment of 2017 that brought a new generation of naming and reckoning, all of it built on the foundation laid in those earlier years. The foundation was not a gift exactly. It was hard-won, at great personal cost to the women who built it. It was not given. It was taken, through persistence and courage and legal argument and the willingness to stand up in a world that would have preferred to remain undisturbed. It was passed forward. That is the word for it. Passed forward, from one generation to the next, like something precious and fragile that requires careful handling and cannot be set down without the risk of being lost. The women working in offices today, the ones sorting their messages and taking their calls and doing their work in the contemporary forms that work has taken, carry this inheritance. Most of them do not think about it in these terms. Why would they? You do not usually think about the history of the floor you're standing on. You simply stand on it. But the floor has a history. And somewhere in the accumulated memory of all the offices where women have worked and endured and organised and insisted and fought, in the walls and the windows and the desks and the particular silence of rooms after the working day has ended, that history is held, quietly, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, simply present, as all past-forward things are present, in the world that was made and continues to be remade, one working day at a time. We have travelled a long way tonight, through offices and courtrooms and consciousness-raising meetings, and the particular quiet of a woman sitting at her desk in the late afternoon, composing in her head a letter she will not send. We have followed the arc from the unnamed to the named, from the invisible to the legally recognised, from the fog of no language to the clarity of a framework built with great care and great effort over many years. We have met women whose names are in the case reporters, Diane Williams, who filed her lawsuit in 1975, and whose case became the first to succeed in a hostile environment claim. Paulette Barnes, who refused to accept that the loss of her job for refusing her supervisor's advances was simply her misfortune and not a legal wrong. Michelle Vinson, whose case travelled all the way to the Supreme Court and came back with a unanimous ruling that changed employment law permanently. We have met women whose names are not in the case reporters but whose experiences built the foundation for everything the legal victories rested on. The thousands of women who filled out the Red Book survey in 1976 and said, yes, this happened to me, and yes, it matters, and yes, I want it to be different. The women who came to consciousness-raising meetings and found, for the first time, language for something they had been carrying alone. The women who organised 9 to 5 and built the Working Women's Institute and mailed the newsletters and held the meetings. We have met the scholars, Lynn Farley, who led the group at Cornell that found the word in 1975, who understood that naming something was the first act of changing it. Catherine McKinnon, who built the legal framework with such precision and persistence that the Supreme Court, a decade later, adopted it essentially as she had described it. And we have met the women who are not named at all in any of this. The women who simply worked, who came in each morning and did their jobs and managed what needed to be managed, and went home in the evening and came back the next day, carrying what they carried in the world as it was given to them. All of them are part of this story. All of them made the story what it is. The office is empty now. It's after 5 o'clock and the last of the women have gone home, and the building is quiet in the particular way that buildings are quiet when the people who animate them have left for the day. The typewriters are still. The appointment books are closed. The filing cabinets hold their contents in the darkness, their steel faces dull and patient. The coffee percolator on the break room counter has been turned off, its warmth fading slowly into the cool air of the evening room. Outside the narrow windows, the city has moved into evening. The light that spent the afternoon shifting from pale to dimmer has become night, and the windows of the building across the street hold the random pattern of people still at their desks, or packing up to leave, or having left already. The lights that stay on after everyone has gone, illuminating empty rooms where work was done and is now finished for the day. Somewhere in this building, in this city, in this country, a woman is walking home from a job in an office. Her coat is buttoned against the air. Her heels on the pavement make a sound that is very specific to this hour, this city, this particular way of ending a working day. She's thinking about something, about dinner or her children, or a conversation she had at lunch, or something she needs to do tomorrow, or nothing in particular, the comfortable vacancy of a mind released from its duties for the evening. She's not thinking about the history she's part of. She does not know she's part of it. She's simply going home. In the morning she will return, she will unlock her desk and set up her workstation, and sort the messages and put the coffee on. She will prepare the space for the day that is coming, the way she has always prepared it, the way the women before her prepared it, the way the women after her will prepare it in the different forms that work will take. The desk will be there, the window will be there, the long, slow day will be there, with its rhythms and its requirements, and its invisible labour and its particular quality of the hours between 8 and 5. But tonight the desk is empty, the chair is empty, the appointment book is closed. The lamp on the desk has been switched off, and the room is lit only by the ambient light from the street, the faint glow that cities emit into the darkness above them, and which finds its way in at the edges of every window. In that light the office is very still. The things in it are still. The work is done for today. Let the thoughts slow. Let the names and the cases and the decades and the courtrooms and the surveys and the legislation all grow very distant, like the sound of typing heard from far away, present, recognizable, and gradually quieter, receding into the background of the night. Let the offices recede into the deeper quiet of the building after hours, the quiet of rooms that have held things and are holding them still, in the dark, in the particular preservation of spaces that are used and then emptied and then filled again. There is something worth sitting with in this quiet before the night takes us completely. Something about what it means for a harm to be finally recognized. For a generation of women, the harm of what happened in those offices was real before it was named. Real in the way that all unacknowledged harms are real. Pressing on the body, shaping the decisions, costing the energy that should have been available for other things. The naming did not create the harm. The naming allowed it to be seen. There is a particular kind of loneliness in experiencing something that the world around you cannot quite acknowledge. It is not like other loneliness, which is the loneliness of being without company. It is the loneliness of being without recognition. The sense that what you are experiencing is not quite legible to the structures and people around you, that it does not fit the available categories, that it will have to be carried privately because there is no public place to put it down. For the women who worked in offices before 1975, before the word existed, the loneliness was often this kind. Not the absence of people who cared about them, but the absence of a framework within which what they were experiencing could be fully acknowledged and responded to. The word, when it came, offered something to put alongside that loneliness, something to carry it differently. If you have ever had an experience that lacked a name, something that was real to you and vivid and significant, but that you struggled to communicate because the available language did not quite fit, you understand something of what it meant for those women when the word arrived. The relief of it, the recognition, the sense of something finally placed, finally seen, finally locatable on the map. Words do not solve everything. Laws do not solve everything. The journey from a word coined in a seminar room in 1975 to a culture that genuinely treats people with dignity at work is long and unfinished, and continues in the present. But they are beginnings, and beginnings matter. You are very still now. The night is deep and soft around you. The long accounting of the days is at rest. The offices are quiet. The streets are quiet. Somewhere the furnace is running in its steady way, and somewhere a clock is marking the late hour, and outside the windows the city is doing what cities do in the deepest part of the night, carrying on quietly in its particular way of being always present and always moving, and in these late hours, blessedly slow. Breathe slowly. Let the office hold you in its particular silence, the silence of a place that has held many things, and continues to hold them, gently, in the dark. The typewriters are still. The coffee is cold, the appointment books are closed, the long work of the day and the long work of the years, and the long work of the women who did what needed to be done in the world as it was given to them. All of it is at rest now. All of it is held in the quiet, where it will be safe until morning. Before you go, I want to ask you something to think about. Not now, but when the morning comes and you're awake again. Which of the women in this story stayed with you? The ones in the case reporters, or the ones whose names we do not know? I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. Sleep now, the morning is still far away. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. See you in the next one.